Hey everyone, and welcome to another episode of Myths, Mysteries, and Majesty. And I'm so happy that I can welcome our brother and podcast partner, Kevin Hughes, back. He's coming from his Freed Indeed Ministries podcast, which link is supplied to you guys in the description of this video. So you can please support our brother in his work and ministry. And before we dive in today's topic, I just wanted to welcome Kevin back and just to see how is he doing, brother. Welcome. How is everything with you?
I am doing very well, and I really appreciate you having me on this show. I love your show is awesome. I've only recently kind of discovered your show, so it's been really fun discovering you cover a lot of just stuff that I find so interesting, and a lot of people aren't covering it, especially from a Christian perspective. So it's been really fun listening, and I really appreciate you having me on again. And so thank you.
Oh, thank you so much. I was also checking your podcast and I was like, dude has over 350 videos. I'm only at 200. I have to speed up. I'm gonna catch him up. But no, seriously, the amount of time and energy you put in your podcast, making all those videos, creating all those beautiful thumbnails for your playlist and everything, I was like, this probably took some time and effort. But I just want to say congratulations. You
Praise
deserve
God.
it, and I hope God will continue blessing your podcast and ministry.
Praise God.
Um,
Thank you for that.
Yes, amen, amen. Um, so I've been wanting to having a chat on the topic of Atlantis for a few months. Unfortunately, that never happened, and I just want to give this as a background intro before we start getting into the topic. And Kevin has graciously accepted last week to come with me and talk about this topic. Now, when it comes to Atlantis, I know that at least when it comes to me, I'm just reminded of my younger years when I would like, I don't know, watch TV shows and movies or maybe read comic books of Atlanteans and all these, right, like mythological aspects, like they were like had supernatural powers, advanced technology, and
Yeah.
all of these sorts. And unfortunately, many times when we face any topic in our lives for the first time, the first thing we hear, the first thing we are told about anything, that unfortunately or not stucks with us for the long time until we learn to unlearn what we were taught initially. And this can happen with anything in life. Uh, so this is one of those topics. If you mention to anyone, they can be religious or irreligious, doesn't matter. They can be very suspicious or laugh at you, like, "Oh, it's one of those, legendary tales." Well, maybe, but maybe not. Uh, the only source, the only credible, somewhat credible source we have when it comes to Atlantis, it's coming from Plato. And it's not even from his first hand, but it's what he recorded from other Greek guys called Timaeus and Critias. So we will soon start explaining how the story came to Plato. But I just wanted to give this as a background that I just want you to be guys open-minded, not just to think about some legendary civilization where people were flying and they were like mini gods and demigods living in this land, but we want to approach this aspect with mindedness, not just from this mythical aspect, but also from historical aspect. So for that,
Mhm.
for this topic, I've read Plato's account and I've covered two other books by two different authors, and they have different conclusions. What could this mysterious island and location of Atlantis be? And they differ, but this is what's beautiful, not just in theology or religion or mythology. It's wonderful in general in life how you can have different sources telling you different things, and even though it can be
Mhm.
confusing and even though it can cause you maybe some doubts, it's good for you to make you want to sit and study, because this is a diligent work that God is commanding us
Yes.
to do. Not just when it comes to these things, because this thing, one, it doesn't affect our devotional life or salvation, of course not. But what if it's important in some way to us? Because if it has some historical accurate information, then why not learning about this? We cannot lose
Right.
by learning more things from the past, because history can repeat and repeat again, and it's very important to learn messages from the past. Um, So when it comes to the Plato's account, according to the book which is coming later in this book, it says that around the 6th century before Christ, this story came to be. Uh, Plato, of course, who lived 4 centuries before Christ, recorded and heard it from by the order um, of this by this order. So first, it was a priest in Egypt who told the story to the great grandfather of Critias. His name was Drapidas, and his brother was Solon. Okay, so Solon told the story to Critias's grandfather, Critias the Elder, who eventually came to the story. The story eventually came to Critias the Younger. Okay, Critias the Younger was the second cousin of Plato, who later recorded that story. So this is what we know. Uh, we cannot, not just us. There's no scholar who can, with 100% accuracy, say, that none of these things is true, or that everything is true. This is why we're called to study diligently and to try to come to some sound conclusion. Okay, so when it comes to the Plato's account, he describes Atlantis in a very interesting way. Timaeus's account is very short. Um, he says there was an island opposite the strait which you can call the Pillars of Heracles, an island larger than Libya and Asia combined. So we are at the very beginning giving with some massive proportions that this island was huge, if of course this account is true. From it, travelers could in those days reach the other islands, and from them, the whole opposite continent, which surrounds what can truly be called the ocean. On this island of Atlantis had arisen a powerful and remarkable dynasty of kings who ruled the whole island and many other islands, as well as parts of the continent. In addition, it controlled within the straits Libya up to the borders of Egypt and Europe as far as Tyrrhenia. This dynasty, gathering its whole power together, attempted to enslave at a single stroke your country, Greece, and yours, and all the territory within the strait. We cannot read everything, but basically, the later account says that after that were earthquakes and floods of extraordinary violence, and in a single dreadful day and night, all your fighting men were swallowed up by the earth, and the island of Atlantis was similarly swallowed up by the sea and vanished. This is why the sea in that area is to this day impassable to navigation, which is hindered by mud just below the surface, the remains of the sunken island. So at the very beginning, there's this dialogue where the Egyptian priest, speaks to Solon, the Critias's great grandfather, and tells him the differences, gives him some historical background. So suppose that according to this account, there are some natural disasters, including the flood, tsunamis, earthquakes. They swallowed up Atlantis, but not just hindered Atlantis, it also hindered the Greece. Okay. Timaeus doesn't write so much about Atlantis. He's only shortly quoting what he remembers here and there. He's focusing on some other parts of the story. But when it comes to Critias, the other person, the second person whom Plato was more closely related, like we said, he was his second cousin. Now we get to something more interesting, and the account is way more longer. Okay. We must first remind ourselves that in all 9,000 years have elapsed since the declaration of war between those who lived outside and all those who lived inside the Pillars of Heracles. So if this was recorded about little over 2,000 years ago, if this account is true, it would mean that the war between Atlantis and Greece happened 11,000 years ago. This is one of the things that gives the scholars to raise their eyebrows and look at this story suspiciously. But still, let's continue. At this time, as we said, Atlantis was an island larger than Libya and Asia put together, though it was subsequently overwhelmed by earthquakes, and it is the source of the impenetrable mud which prevents the free passage of those who sail out of the straits into the open sea. Now, here comes a very interesting part, at least for me, which closely parallels what Dr. Michael Heiser calls the divine council, not just him, also the scholars who came before him and after him. And we can we can see in this particular passage, we can see some biblical parallels with Deuteronomy 32. Okay, so listen to this. It says, once upon a time, the gods divided up the earth between them, not in the course of a quarrel. It would be quite wrong to think that the gods do not know what is appropriate to them, or that knowing it, they would want to annex what properly belongs to others. Each gladly received his just allocation and settled his territories. And having done so, they proceeded to look after us meaning humans, their creatures and children, as shepherds look after their flocks. So at the very beginning, Kevin, we see, like I said, parallels with Deuteronomy 32, where God divided the planet and allotted to the sons of God. But then he says that he kept Israel for himself. And I want to mention a name of one deity, which is coming soon. And then I would like you to comment on this.
Sure.
They did not use physical means of control, like shepherds who direct their flock with blows, but brought their influence to bear on the creature's most sensitive part, using persuasion as a steersman uses the helm to direct the mind as they saw fit, and so guide the whole mortal creature. The various gods then administered the various regions which had been allotted to them. But Athene and Hephaestus, who shared as brother and sister a common character and pursue the same ends in their love of knowledge and skill, were allotted this land of ours as their joint sphere and as a suitable and natural home for excellence and wisdom. They produced a native race of good men and gave them suitable political arrangements. Their names have been preserved, but what they did has been forgotten because of the destruction of their successors and the long lapse of time. For as we said before, the survivors of this destruction were unlettered mountain race who had just heard the names of the rulers of the land, but knew little of their achievements. So what we see at the very beginning, like I said, is that the land of Atlantis was supposedly divided. And before that even happened, their main deity happened to be Poseidon. So Poseidon's country happened to be Atlantis. So now he comes on the scene, and the land is divided, and the land is allotted to him the same way we see in Deuteronomy 32, that the whole land, the whole country, the whole planet is divided to different deities, the small g gods, or the sons of God. Kevin, do you think there could be any biblical influence in this story? And if not direct influence, then what do these parallels tell us about the ancient people?
Yeah. So I would point out that throughout pretty much all the ancient world, there are certain stories that are universal. And we often hear this, and what we often hear is that there are certain stories that are universal, and one of the ones that we all hear about is the idea of a flood. And that just about every culture on Earth, no matter how far spread apart they are, has some kind of mythology surrounding a flood. And interestingly enough, though, it actually goes deeper than that. So I'm going to read a section of Genesis here. Genesis 6, about 1 through 4. It says, "When man began to multiply on the face of the land, and daughters were born to them, The sons of God saw that the daughters of man were attractive, and they took as their wives any they chose. Then the Lord said, My spirit shall not abide in man forever, for he is flesh, and his days shall be 120 years. The Nephilim, or giants, were on the earth in those days, and also afterward, when the sons of God came to the daughters of men, and they bore children to them. These were the mighty men who were of old, the men of renown. So the reason why I read that specific section that has probably been, depending on where you go to church, that's probably been passed over on your yearly Bible study, because that's not really the section that most people focus on when they read this story, but it's actually hugely important. And Nicola mentioned Dr. Michael Heiser, the late, great Dr. Michael Heiser. And Dr. Michael Heiser's work really opened a lot of people's eyes to a broader reality of what's going on in this passage, because what Genesis is doing here is making reference to some other mythologies that it's assumed that Moses's audience would be familiar with. And so now he's responding to that. He's not embracing everything that happens in those mythologies. He's correcting it, because in those mythologies, this is seen as a good thing, whereas God is showing us that it was actually a bad thing. But the point is that, you know, you asked if I see any biblical parallels or biblical influence, and I do, not in that I don't think the Greeks had a copy of, you know, the Torah and that they understood that this was the influence. But if we believe that the story written in the Bible is true, then it makes sense that it was preserved somehow. And it was preserved as it was disseminated throughout the entire earth, but it was preserved not always perfectly, and it was often preserved through mythology. So in this case, we see actually a lot of parallels here, more than even a lot of scholars recognize. So for one thing, this text talks about the Nephilim, which Nephilim is Hebrew, it means giant, but we lose a little bit of that because we think giant means really tall person, and to some extent that was probably true, but in ancient Hebrew, the word Nephilim also had a different connotation, and excuse me, and in order to understand that connotation, I think a good way of thinking about it is, you know, when I was younger, there was a dictator whose name was Manuel Noriega. And when people would talk about Manuel Noriega, they would call him a strong man. Well, they didn't mean that he was like able to bench press really heavy weight. They meant that he was a tyrant and that he ruled a country with an iron fist. And the ancient Israelites had a similar expression to that. They would call someone a giant. So this is why in the Psalms, when it talks about the Exodus, it refers to Pharaoh as the Egyptian giant. Well, that doesn't mean that Pharaoh was really, really tall. It means that Pharaoh was this iron-fisted tyrant. So the reason why I share that is because in the Atlantis narrative, we see the same thing. These Atlanteans are these tyrants. They're these men of war. They build this empire. These are all the things that Genesis is telling us, but Genesis describes it in just a few verses because they assume that you're familiar with it from other stories. We've lost those other stories for the most part, which is why I always encourage people to read the Book of Enoch. The Book of Enoch goes into a lot more detail. I'm not saying the Book of Enoch should be included in the canon, but I'm just saying it helps you understand what's happening here in Genesis if you do read the Book of Enoch, because the Book of Enoch fills in a lot of these gaps about what's happening. But the point is that you have this story about these tyrants, these persecutors, going around conquering everything, subduing everyone, and imposing their will and causing a lot of mayhem and chaos and destruction. And that's what God is talking about, that the wickedness of man is great in the earth. Every intention of his thoughts are evil continually. And then God sends the flood, and it destroys the nation of Atlantis, or it destroys the whole antediluvian world. So we see a lot of parallels there, and I think it's important to note these parallels because I think there's a good argument to be made that the Atlantis story and these other myths that go along with it are all stories that inform us about what sort of the cultural memory of the fact that there was a world before the earth was flooded, and then there was a great cataclysmic flood event, and that great cataclysmic flood event created a huge transformation to the world. So we see in the end of the Atlantis myth that um, he describes the people who are left as these mountain herdsmen who were illiterate, and that's why the story that's why a lot of these achievements don't come down to us in necessarily a perfect way, because he's saying that these people didn't have writing, and so they only had oral traditions to share to us. So he's saying that, well, what's interesting about that to me is that in Genesis, at the end of the flood narrative, we see Noah and his family leave the ark at Mount Ararat and descend the mountain and go out and, spread out from there. So they would have passed on the flood narrative and the rest of the narrative of the antediluvian world starting from that mountain. And so in a literal sense, I think that's what Plato's story is calling to mind. But I also think that Plato's story calls to mind the fact that he says the only people who survived this event were passed on this oral tradition, and now we have these details. So Plato is kind of or actually the priest who tells this story is kind of acknowledging the truth that all of these different cultures have these flood mythologies because there's a true story that they have a cultural memory of, but it's imperfect, it's incomplete. Well, we have that perfect and complete story because we're the people of God. We have the rest of the story. We have the fact that God flooded the earth because of the sons of God and the daughters of men. So we have this full story, and the other ancient societies are also narrating this story, but it's not preserved with all of the details, if that makes sense. So I totally believe that we're seeing examples of, again, when we're saying in a case like this, when we're saying that there's biblical influence, I don't mean that the Bible literally was written before this story, or anything like that. What I mean is that the true story that's recorded in the Bible is what's influencing the story of Atlantis. And we can get into a little bit more of the details in that a little bit later, I suspect. But that's where I would go with that.
Thanks for that. I just want to, when I was reading Plato's account of Atlantis this week, and when I came to this section, which again, for me, it's so relatable to Deuteronomy 32.
Yes.
I was thinking, because unfortunately the Bible in that section doesn't tell us so much how this was working, and I was thinking, well, could it be? I'm not saying it is, but could it be that in some ancient myths, the documents that we have left, that what is preserved to this day, couldn't we catch little pieces of the whole truth that we don't know? Could it be that in some crazy way God could have used Gentiles like Plato,
Mm-hmm.
who is also called a proto-Christian, to tell us, maybe, even though through some mythical stories, how this allotment between these sons of gods and deities, happen between them, and how their wickedness happened because they wanted glory for themselves. They didn't rule well. They didn't judge well.
Right.
And then to go from that point, from Deuteronomy 32 to Psalm 82, when God comes in the midst of gods, that's the proper translation. He's scorning them for judging wrong, and he's about to proclaim the judgment. So I'm thinking, could it be that some of these stories, even though we don't know if anything is factual, but could it be through some of these stories we can catch how the ruling of these fallen deities, once when they were put there by Yahweh, could it be that we can see a glimpse of true story how they fell? So I just want to read this section a little bit again, and then I want to go to the next page. I just want to remind the audience what I read 5 minutes ago, that Hephaestus, I'm trying to read the word, I promise, and Athens, who shared his brother and sister a common character and pursued the same ends in their love of knowledge and skill, were allotted this land of ours as their joint sphere. When it says this land of ours, this is speaking about Greece, right? Because Athens was in Greece. This is why the capital is called Athens to this day, right? But now check out the next page. Poseidon's share was the island of Atlantis, and he settled the children born to him by a mortal woman. Ooh! So when you mention Genesis 6, look what's happening now with Poseidon and the daughter, not daughters, but the daughter. We'll soon read this. Okay, so Poseidon's share was the island of Atlantis, and he settled the children born to him by a mortal woman in a particular district of it. At the center of the island, near the sea, was a plain, said to be the most beautiful and fertile of all plains, and near the middle of this plain, about 50 stades inland, a hill of no great size. Okay, now he's mentioning some names. Okay, here there lived one of the original earth-born inhabitants called Evenor, with his wife Lucip. It's almost like Lucy with Lucip with P at the end. They had an only child, a daughter called Cleito. She was just of marriageable age when her father and mother died, and Poseidon was attracted by her, again, so much like the fallen ones in Genesis 6, and had intercourse with her. That's a completely different story. How was a deity able to have a sex with a woman? But again, this is very like Genesis 6. And fortified the hill where she lived by enclosing it with concentric rings of sea and land. There were 2 rings of land and 3 of sea, like cartwheels, with the island at their center from each other. Making the place inaccessible to men, for there was no ships or sailing in those days. He equipped the central island with godlike lavishness. He made 2 springs flow, one of hot and one of cold water, and caused the earth to grow abundant produce of every kind. He begot 5 pairs of male twins, brought them up, and divided the island of Atlantis into 10 parts, which he distributed between them. He allotted the elder of the eldest pair of twins his mother's home district and the land surrounding it, the biggest and best allocation, and made him king over the others. And the others he made governors, each of a populous and large territory. So this whole next segment is about how then these people who seem honestly to be demigods, how they were like ruling. Okay, but before we go to that page, like, you went before me, even though I don't know if you knew the section I was about to read. So we see how Greece was given to Athens and her brother, and then the island of Atlantis was given to Poseidon. Poseidon comes there to dwell, sees this beautiful young lady whose parents just died. He had intercourse with her and begets 10 sons. And to these 10 sons, he divides the island of Atlantis and gives them to rule over them. And we'll see later, because these people eventually die, but their children continue, ruling over this land. I mean, how mind-blowing is this? Again, like I
Exactly.
said, even though we don't know much between what was happening between Deuteronomy 32 and Psalm 82, like God gave the nations to all the sons of God, but kept Israel for himself. Okay. And then in Psalm 82, God comes and judges this wicked small e Elohim because they didn't rule and judge righteously. Okay, but what was happening in this time? Like, we don't know. So when I'm reading this, I'm like, dang it! Like, could it be again that, even though I'm not saying this is true, but could it be that in some aspects of different mythologies, world mythologies, we see some glimpses of truth that can help us understand? Because later we'll see that these people were worshiping Poseidon, and at no point of time was he pointing to someone bigger than him, meaning
Hmm.
Yahweh, the God of the Bible. So I just want to ask you before I go to the next page, if maybe we can somehow hope that there could be in mythical stories like this, that there could be some traces of truth that we can put between, Deuteronomy 32 and Psalm 82.
Well, I would say we don't have to even hope. I think we can rest assured that it's most certainly the case that there are truths preserved in the pagan mythology. Saint Basil the Great expresses that very clearly, but within Scripture we see this very clearly expressed in at least two places that come to mind really clearly. One of them is Psalm 24, or Psalm 23 in the Septuagint. Psalm 24, it says, "The earth is the Lord's and the fullness thereof, the world and all those that dwell therein. For he has founded it upon the seas and established it upon the rivers. Who shall ascend the hill of the Lord? Who shall stand in his holy place? He who has clean hands and a pure heart, who does not lift up his soul to what is false, and who does not swear deceitfully. He will receive blessing from the Lord and righteousness from the God of his salvation. Such is the generation of those who seek him, who seek the face of the God of Jacob." And then here's the part that I'm really driving at. "Lift up your heads, O you gates. Be lifted up, O ancient doors, that the King of glory may come in. For who is this King of glory? The Lord strong and mighty, the Lord mighty in battle. Lift up your heads, O ye gates. Lift them up, O ancient doors. Then the King of glory may come. Who is this King of glory? The Lord Sabaoth. He is the King of glory." Okay, so why did I just read Psalm 24? Because this directly answers your question. And the reason why is because we know when we translated the Baal cycle, which is older than this psalm, we discovered something very fascinating. King David got this psalm from the Baal cycle. In the Baal cycle, there's a specific. So, for those of you who don't know, the Baal cycle is the liturgical text of the worshippers of Baal, so Babylon and Mesopotamia. And in the Baal cycle, so basically it's their Bible. And what happens is the event that's being described in the passage where King David used to get this is there's a rebellion happening, and Baal is going to overthrow the Most High God. And so he goes to the divine council and he tells his plan to the divine council. He says, "Look, all of us gods can overthrow the Most High God because there's one of him and there's a whole bunch of us. So let's get together and let's do this." And what happens is that these two beings show up. And these two beings are basically like archangels. And they show up and they say, "What are you guys doing? You're plotting against the Most High God Yom. And he knows what you're doing." And all of the gods start trembling and they bow their heads. And this is actually the moment where the tides turn in the story, because Baal stands up in the midst of the assembly. And in this story, remember that from this perspective, Baal is supposed to be the good guy. So he stands up and he says, "Lift up your heads, O you gods. Be lifted up, O everlasting ones. And then he describes himself as the King of Glory, and basically describes that he's going to overthrow the Most High God Yom. So what does the psalmist do? The psalmist takes that story and says, yeah, that's not how it happened. The psalmist says, no, this is the truth. So you've heard this story from Baal's perspective. You've heard Baal's propaganda, but let me tell you what really happened. What really happened is that the earth is the Lord's and the fullness thereof. Everything belongs to God, including you and me. All the inhabitants of the earth belong to the Most High God, to the true God, Yahweh. And then this founded on the seas and established on the rivers. Yom in the Baal cycle is actually the god of the sea. So the Most High God was the god of the sea. Well, King David says, guess who the real god of the sea is? Yahweh, who established everything upon the seas, who divided the land from the sea. And who shall ascend the hill of the Lord? Who shall stand in his holy place? Only he who has clean hands and a pure heart. Not you, Baal. Baal doesn't get to ascend. He doesn't have clean hands or a pure heart. He has lifted his soul up to what's false, and he's sworn deceitfully, because he's been telling you that he overthrew the Most High God, and he didn't. So he swears deceitfully. He doesn't belong in the court of God. And then the psalmist throws the very words of Baal back at him. Lift up your heads, O ye gates. Rise up, ancient doors, and the King of Glory will come in. So this passage, the way that the Orthodox Church uses this passage in our liturgical cycle is actually we use it at funerals, and we use it on Pascha, or in the West, Easter, and we use it to proclaim Christ's victory over the gates of hell. Lift up your heads, O ye gates, be lifted up, ancient doors, that the King of Glory may come in. And the demon responds with trembling, who is this King of Glory? The Lord strong and mighty, the Lord mighty in battle. Jesus Christ has thrown down the gates of hell, destroyed their authority, destroyed their power, and ransomed hell. He's taken captivity captive. So the Baal cycle was preserving this truth in a sense, but it was preserving it from the villain's perspective, we might say. It's like that movie with Joaquin Phoenix, Joker, where the Joker is the one that we're telling his story instead of Batman's. It's the same thing here. It's like this is the story from the perspective of the villain. He's telling all of his worshipers, yeah, I had this plan which, by the way, if you read the Baal cycle, it's actually kind of hilarious, because he comes up with this plan and he goes and he fights the Most High God, and in the story he like totally wins, but then just, by coincidence, because he so totally won, he then has to set up his throne in the underworld, not in heaven. Because that's totally what you would do if you won the fight, right? You would leave.
He's so humble.
Exactly. And then the other passage that I think totally proves what you were saying, I won't read the whole passage, but Isaiah chapter 14 and Ezekiel chapter 28, I won't read them all. People can read them at home. I don't want to take up Nicola's whole show just reading and exegeting passages of scripture to you guys. You can read them. But in both of those passages, Isaiah and Ezekiel do something very interesting, because in both passages, they are addressing the kings of foreign nations. And in both passages, they use the mythology of those nations. So the mythology of Tyre and the mythology of Babylon, they use that mythology, but they turn it around. And so in the Baal cycle, again, Babylon's mythology, Baal ascended up into the court of the Most High God and into the seat of the divine council, and he overthrew the Most High God. In Isaiah 14, it says, You, king of Babylon, you did this. You went and you ascended to the place of the Most High God. You said, I will be like unto the Most High God. I will go and I will overthrow the Most High God. And so you did that, but it didn't work out the way you've been telling the Babylonians that it worked out, did it? No, you were like a falling star because you got cast down out of heaven when you tried this, and you're an idiot who thought you could overthrow God. And God is all powerful. You can't overthrow him. That's stupid. And so Isaiah is actually mocking him, but he's mocking him with the words of his own mythology that he's been telling people. Same thing happens with Ezekiel. In Ezekiel 28, he describes Satan he's talking to the king of Tyre, and then as he progresses, though, he starts talking to the god of Tyre, not just the earthly king, but the god who reigns over Tyre and through whom the earthly king of Tyre derives his power. And he describes this god in the exact same language of the mythology of the Babylonians and the Sidonians. He uses the same language of this god being bright and beautiful and powerful and having a beautiful singing voice and all these things. He uses the exact words of their mythology, but then he says that because of your pride and your sin, you were cast down. So again, he takes the story and he takes what's true from it, but then he says, but that's not the story you've been telling, is it? You've been telling people the story. You've been telling them the truth, but you haven't been telling them the whole truth, because what really happened is you lost. And that's why you shouldn't be opposing Yahweh now. You're opposing Yahweh again in his people, and it may look like you're succeeding, but you will fail once again because you've always failed. And we see that that's true. Jesus Christ has defeated the world, the flesh, and the devil. Jesus Christ has set us free from the power and presence of sin. And now his church is being established in all the earth. And all the nations that once worshipped Baal, now those nations worship the true God. Those nations became Christian and worshipped the true God. I mean, unfortunately, Islam came and swept over a lot of those nations, but at least for a time, they all worshipped the true God, and there are still people in all of those nations who worship the true God, and there are no people in any of those nations who worship Baal or Zeus or any of these entities. All of the people have come to worship Christ. And so Jesus Christ, by his cross, has conquered all of these entities. And that's what the prophets were speaking about. They were saying, Yahweh has defeated you and you're still challenging him, but it's not going to work. He will always have the last word. So is there truth in these myths? Yes, there is truth in these myths, and it actually, as St. Basil says, it actually is valuable even for us to study these myths to discern that truth. However, you have to remember that the ones who gave us these myths are the bad guys in the true story. So you have to remember that the myths aren't going to be totally accurate. And then you had actually asked one other question, which was, how can one of these gods impregnate a woman? And that's a really good question. And this is answered in Second Temple literature as ritualistically. Through ritual, they are able to somehow unite themselves to a human man. And this ritual is actually described for us not in the Book of Enoch, but this ritual is described for us in the Epic of Gilgamesh. And in the life of Gilgamesh, we know that this ritual is described for us because Gilgamesh is described as being 2/3 what's called Apkallu. And the Apkallu were basically a race of lesser gods who the Mesopotamians believed came They actually believe they came up from the abyss, and the story is really creepy. I would love somebody to make a horror movie out of it. But they come up from the abyss and they start teaching people these rituals through which they're able to take possession of a human man, and then he impregnates a human woman, and then that child is considered one third the son of the king or priest who impregnated the woman, one third the son of that woman herself, and one third the son of the deity who had taken possession. But here's the thing, because the king or priest is basically, because his function is as the go-between people and the deity, he is himself a deity. So therefore, 2/3 of this child's lineage are divine, and 1/3, the third coming from the human woman, is human. So this is why Gilgamesh is called 2/3 Apkallu, because his human father was actually a god, so to speak. His divine father was a god, and then his mother was a woman. So 2/3 of his, I guess, genealogy. This is not like a biological claim. This is a ritualistic claim. So 2/3 of the ritual are divine beings, and that's why Gilgamesh is supposedly so powerful in the story, is because he's actually 2/3 a god in that narrative. So I'm not saying that this is like 100% true, or that we should start doing this to try to have stronger kids or anything like that. But I'm saying that we've seen that God allowed the demons to kind of preserve their side of the account through these mythologies. And so as a result, we are able to answer some questions about what's happening in Genesis, and we're able to answer some questions about what's happening in the Atlantis mythology, because the Atlantis mythology is just giving us more details about what's happening, because unlike Yahweh, who wants to tell us the story of why the flood happened, but he wants to tell us the true story, the demons want to tell us their side, and their side involves, hey, we just saw these women, thought they were beautiful, and we impregnated them. They're not telling you that that was evil. They're just saying that it happened. God tells us that it was evil. They give us some of their kind of details of their story. So yes, I think that everything you said was totally spot on. Yes, these accounts are worthy of our attention because they contain elements of the truth, and understanding that truth can actually help us to understand Scripture in a richer and fuller way, which then helps us to see what Jesus is doing in his earthly ministry as well, because you can't understand the New Testament if you failed to understand the Old Testament. So that's why we're doing what we're doing today, because it actually does have a lot of value for the Christian.
I enjoyed so much the conversation. I didn't want to interrupt, except once when I made the joke about Baal being so humble. I want to say three things before we go further. First,
Absolutely.
half of your story was like a sermon of Jesus being victorious and all these fallen deities falling down. So I was like, yes, preach. Yes, like we need to hear more of these things, right? Because that's an important part of the gospel, which unfortunately in the Western part of the church is kind of lost, that mythical part, but not the imaginary legendary part, but that mythical supernatural aspect that is true. So I'm glad that you're speaking about that, because people from my church, from our branch of Christianity, we need to hear more often about these things so they can be less like foreign to us and more like, oh yeah, Jesus is coming totally to subdue these fallen beings. So that's the first thing I wanted
Yes.
to say. Second thing, I also love when you mentioned some clear parallels in the between the Old Testament and some other mythical parts, like with the Baal cycle. We covered Baal cycle with, I think, was it Carrie uh, like several months ago. Anyway, we talked how many sections of the Old Testament are intentionally polemical. You know how many times Christians who want to abandon their faith, they're questioning, or people who already uh, or people who already left the faith or are skeptics and they never came to faith. One of their usual arguments is like, well, the Bible stole a lot from the Gentile narrative, so like the Bible is just a copycat of other foreign foreign and older myths, but that's not true. Moses and a lot of prophets in the Old Testament, they knew what their surrounding neighbors believed. They knew their gods, they knew their traditions and religions. So they intentionally took portions from their so-called scriptures, from their narratives, from their myths, but they changed it. So just like you say, they were portrayed the right story and the right the accurate information when it comes to Yahweh. So we should not be afraid or concerned when we see these aspects, because a lot of Old Testament was written in that polemical aspect, which we can see also partially in Acts when Paul comes in Athens and he's like observing. He's like, oh, this statue, this idol to the unknown God. Well, I came to you to proclaim this to you. So he's using this narrative they already know.
Exactly.
He's just coming with a full revelation. But and then he quotes these pagan Greek poets and philosophers. So this is not new to the Bible, but unfortunately a lot of us, we don't know this, so we get scared like, oh, this was stolen. It's not stolen. It's written with polemical argument. And the third thing I wanted to say is that I fully agree with you when you said that through sexual rights, uh, uh, rights, so rights, that this intercourse between a deity, or I don't want to say demonic entity, but that's the closest I can think of
Mhm.
right now, and a human being was happening through this magical religious rites. Okay, so we also covered this in one of the episodes, and basically the story is not just an ancient story, because I read an article of a Japanese, was it a president
Mhm.
or a king, like a year or two ago, who wanted to repeat the same
Yeah,
ritual
the
in
emperor.
Japan.
Mhm.
So basically, it would work that uh, I don't know if he did it or that was the story that he was about to do it. I hope he didn't do it. But basically, the story in the ancient times would be like that someone from a high class, like you said, a king, a royalty, would go to the temple prostitute or a temple priestess, and she would be indwelled by this demonic entity of her god or goddess that she's following. And when the king or the royalty or nobleman, supposedly nobleman, will have an intercourse with her, that child will take the DNA or the nature of all three so-called parents,
That's
right?
right.
And then the baby will come that will be not completely human. So when you were talking about it, I'm like, yeah, but again, we don't know, was this happening between Poseidon and this woman? It perfectly, I mean, it makes sense. So when I said, how did this happen? I'm like, yeah, we know about this story, but I don't know if there are like some other ways that, Poseidon as an spiritual entity could embody maybe someone, not in a way to possess a human male, but in some way to indwell someone in, just for the sake to have intercourse with a woman and then leave that body, or maybe even stay in the body of that male until that male is alive. We don't know, but these speculations are not without any foundation. Before I
Exactly.
continue reading, I want to read a question from Sean. You met Sean last week.
Yeah. Hi, Sean.
Okay, so the question is, I've heard that the ritual bed of Marduk was the same dimensions as the bed of Og in the Old Testament. Does this indicate that Og was part demon?
um, do you want to tackle the question or do you want me?
Well, it says Kevin,
Oh
and
yeah,
since
it says Kevin. Sorry. Yes.
you're better informed than me, I mean, I can only
I just
speculate. Yeah,
I just realized
I
that it
leave it
said
to the
that it
experts.
was addressed to me. I just realized it was addressed to me. Sorry about that. Yes. So Og, the king of Bashan, he's for those of you who don't know, he's referring to I believe it's in the book of Numbers is where it shows this, but it says that his bed, it describes his bed, and when it And sometimes people are like, why does it describe his bed? That's weird. Well, it's because in the ancient world, see, the Israelites weren't dumb. They knew what their neighbors were doing. So it's not like the Israelites just, were these idiotic people. And that's, you mentioned actually earlier, sorry to go off on a slight tangent here. I'll try to keep it really short, but you mentioned earlier how skeptics will say like, oh, the Bible stole these stories from Gentiles. Like, I don't know if these skeptics think that ancient Israelites were just morons who couldn't tell what plagiarism was. It's not like ancient Israelites were reading Isaiah going, I don't know what this is about. No, they knew he was referencing pagan mythology. That's why the story resonated with them, because they had some familiarity with this story. Anyway, I digress from that. The point is, it mentions his bed because it's actually the dimensions it describes are the dimensions of ritual beds from, lo and behold, the practices of Israel's neighbors. And those ritual beds were the actual physical beds that were used in the ritual that I was describing earlier and that Nicola was describing as well. Rituals that are still practiced to this very day in some parts of the world. Well, among Israel's neighbor, they used a specific bed for it, and the dimensions of that bed are the exact dimensions given for Og's bed, which can only mean two things. It either means that he himself was a Nephilim, or it means that he was trying to produce Nephilim, or it could theoretically mean both, which is actually what I think is probably true, is that it was both. He was a Nephilim, and he was making more Nephilim in this ritual bed. And this is actually why in the Psalms we see the destruction of Og, the son of Bashan, the Og, the king of Bashan. It only gets like a couple verses in the scriptures where it describes the defeat of Og. But when you read the Psalms, there are tons of references to the Israelites defeating Og, the king of Bashan. And so this was clearly a very important event in Israel's history. And still today, in the Orthodox Church, in our liturgical life, we have one of our Psalms. I'm not going to sing it. Don't worry. I won't subject you guys to that. But we do sing.
Only if you can do the Gregorian chanting, that's allowed. Only that.
Well, you don't want to hear me singing, but people who can actually sing and sing well join the choir, and they sing that Og, the king of Bashan, you, O God, have defeated Og, the king of Bashan. Hallelujah, hallelujah. So this is like a common thing within Christianity and within Judaism, that Og, the king of Bashan, was like a really big deal, and Yahweh, God, enabled the Israelites to destroy him. And the reason he was such a big deal is because, as Sean kind of alludes to in his question, yes, Og was to some extent related to a demonic entity through ritual, and therefore was a Nephilim. He also was, in all likelihood, producing more Nephilim, or at least trying to, and that's why the Israelites are commanded to wipe out the people of Bashan, because that's another thing too, by the way. In the Old Testament, the whole thing about where it's like, oh, why were the Israelites so violent? Well, they were only commanded violence in certain places. And when you look at the tribes they were actually commanded to wipe out, all of them were tribes that were practicing the Nephilim ritual. So all of them were tribes that were united to demons in this very specific way.
Thank you. I noticed that section is left out in many Bible commentaries, even coming from some sound theologians and scholars and Bible commentators. I'm like, Are they afraid that someone will laugh at them, that this was a big deal when God would say, go and annihilate them, devote them to destruction? Like, could it be that it's not a coincidence? Could it be that God was sending Israelites to destroy these nations that had the giants? That's been
Exactly.
in my mind for a long time, but not many scholars are assessing this. So I'm like, it should be kind of obvious if you study, and these scholars know
Right.
way more than me, yet barely anyone talks about this aspect.
Well, they don't talk about it because so a great book that does talk about it is God is a Man of War by Father Stephen DeYoung. That's an awesome scholarly book that does talk about it, and I think you would really enjoy that book. But most scholars, especially in the West, don't like to talk about it because the idea of ritually creating demon human hybrids is something they're very uncomfortable with conceptually. And the reason for that is because, unfortunately, even at least in the West, even people who are in the church who should know better, by default, we tend to be materialists. So we tend not to really want to believe that the spiritual realm is active and involved in the world in a very direct way. But if you take the Bible seriously, and if you take Christian truth claims seriously, then I really don't think you can get around the fact that the spiritual realm is very active, and I don't see any reason to. I think we should embrace it. And that's why I love your show. Just to give another little plug here, that's why I love your show so much, is because you do take it seriously and you're willing to talk about, like, okay, why are all these ancient people talking about fairies and vampires and all this stuff? Why are they doing this? Well, let's take a look at the actual source material here. Let's examine it. Let's ask ourselves this question instead of just making some kind of sweeping assertion that all ancient people were morons and we don't have to take them seriously. Let's ask what they were really talking about here. And I just love that so much. So I appreciate what you're doing.
Thank you. I didn't plan to go this rabbit hole, but since Sean mentioned something else, I have to ask this
Uh-oh.
question. And I remember while I was studying in Moody, I asked this question to the professor, and he didn't know. And I don't blame him, because the question I'm about to ask is very difficult one, and only through studying these fringe topics and ancient Near East mythologies we can try to get some context and answer. Without that, we can't even speculate, but at least with this background we can speculate. So based on what Sean wrote, and I'll read it, I have a question for you, Kevin.
Okay.
He says seed wars, the seed of the woman going to the war with the seed of the serpent. Yes. Okay, now I'm just cross-referencing with at least one passage in the Gospels, and I'm googling to find the exact passage in the Gospel, because I didn't prepare to ask this question, and I came to Matthew 13. Now there could be more examples in the Gospels, I don't know, but one of the parables that Jesus was giving is found in Matthew 13. And then okay, let's read a few verses. Matthew 13, 24 and onwards. Then Jesus used another story to teach them. Jesus said, God's kingdom is like a man who planted good seed in his field. That night, while everyone was asleep, the man's enemy came and planted weeds among the wheat and then left. Later, the wheat grew and heads of grain grew on the plants. But at the same time, the weeds also grew. Then the man's servant came to him and said, you planted good seed in your field. Where did the weeds come from? The man answered, an enemy planted weeds. The servant asked, did you want us to go and pull up the weeds? He answered, no, because when you pull up the weeds, you might also pull up the wheat. Let the weeds and the wheat grow together until the harvest time. At the harvest time, I will tell the workers this. First, gather the weeds and tie them together to be burned. Then gather the wheat and bring it to my barn. Okay, so now I don't want to spiritualize this section too much, but look, the weeds are obviously human beings, and
Mm-hmm.
I don't want to go too much into some, that humans are all born evil. We do inherit sinful nature. I don't want to go with the doctrine that we inherit Adam's sin and that the moment we come to this planet, we are sinners doomed to hell. I don't want to go there. I used to believe that. I don't believe anymore. If someone still does, that's okay. That's not my point here. My point is here, these weeds are humans. They're growing and living with us. If we just spiritualize this parable and say, well, these are regular beings to whom Satan comes and plants the seed, so they can sin, they can hate God, they can turn to resist God all their lives, and then just die as, I don't know, atheists or God haters or whatever. I can say, fine, that's a regular, normal, spiritualized understanding of the parable. But what if the Satan can actually plant, I don't know, it's just a speculation, it's a question. Somehow, what if the Satan is able or was able to plant a human being that will, not just the idea, but the actual DNA, or a human being that will grow and rise and be that will be like the type of an antichrist, not the antichrist, but an antichrist. And that provoked me to ask you, because of what you and Sean have been corresponding between the King Og and the size of his bed as Nephilim and demonic rituals, and how this is all happening. And now, because I was inspired by what Sean said again, the seed wars. I remember asking the same question like several years ago to one of my professors. He said, "Of course, we don't know how this happened." So I just want to ask you, in your studies, Kevin, besides this spiritual understanding that the devil can plant the seed in our mind and hearts to reject God, do you think there could be another understanding of this passage, that this could be actually people, not just ideas in their minds, but they're people who are growing, I don't know how, but somehow planted by the devil?
Yeah, so the spiritual understanding is obviously primary, like you said. So in the spiritual understanding, this is a picture of the church, because the church has the wheat and the tares grow together, because we can't tell right now who is wheat and who is tares. And if we're honest, all of us have some tare-ness to us, and we're in the process of being conformed to Christ. So, I want to be very clear that is primary, and that interpretation is definitely not wrong, and that is what Jesus is primarily saying. Now, as far as like the implication of it for the broader world and the broader worldview, and the implication of it that ties into what we're talking about, I don't know for sure if that parable is specifically talking about people like Og of Bashan, but I think it applies in the sense of exactly what we're talking about, that through ritual, the seed of the serpent really genuinely does. I mean, okay, so biologically, by DNA, these people are humans just like you and I, because they would be, because physically speaking, there's a human being possessed and a human being taken advantage of and all these things. So physically, biologically, I'm sure that a DNA test wouldn't be like, oh, this DNA test shows that you're the son of Satan. That's not what I'm saying, but I'm saying that they have a connection to that, and people and there's a reason why God commanded the Israelites to, wipe these people out, and not, whereas with other people, frankly, there are other examples in Scripture where God says, do not kill any women or children, only kill the fighting men. And that's really rare in the ancient world. In the ancient world, you don't see that very often. It's much more normal to see people getting wiped out. But God specifically commands the Israelites not to in most cases. He commands them to when it's the giants. Why that is? Probably because these rituals are creating something evil, and that evil needs to be put in check. So, with that said, I do think, Genesis 3:15 it does say, I will put enmity between you and the woman, between your offspring and her offspring, and he shall bruise your head, and you shall bruise his heel. So when we talk about seed wars, the most important thing to note is that Jesus Christ is the truest example of the seed of the woman, because he has no human father. He is the one true seed of the woman, the Son of God and the son of the Theotokos. And and he is the one who fulfills this prophecy. His heel was bruised on the cross, but yet he bruised the head, or struck the head, of Satan himself. And so he destroyed the presence and power of Satan, and then sends his church conquering and to conquer, to bring all the world under his dominion. I saw the Jude 1:4, and I apologize, I don't have that memorized off the top of my head, so I'll have to look at it. For certain people have crept in unnoticed, who long ago were designated for condemnation. Okay, yeah, this ungodly people who pervert the grace of God into sensuality and deny our Master and Lord Jesus Christ. Nicola may know more about this than I do, but if memory serves, this passage is directly talking about the Gnostics, because what Gnostics would do is they would come and they would join the church, and then they would start sort of disseminating Gnostic ideas, and then they would pull people away from the church. So one day you would have all these people who had become Christians, and they were part of the church, and then they would be, teaching people these Gnostic ideas about the pleroma, and about these weird, perverse ideas. And then all of a sudden, one day they would either be kicked out or they would leave the church, but they would take a whole bunch of, usually catechumens, unfortunately, they would take a whole bunch of them with them. So that's why apparently this had happened in Antioch, and a whole bunch of people had left the church because of these actions of these Gnostics. And that's actually part of the reason why St. John wrote the epistle, 1 John. He wrote that epistle, and in that epistle he says, they were not of us, for if they had been of us, they would not have gone out from us. And he's specifically talking about these Gnostics who would come into the churches and pretend to be Christians so that they could kind of preach their false things, and then it would lead people astray. And so he tells this, and he's saying, like, I know it's discouraging to see this happen, but you have to remember that they were never really part of us, because if they had been part of us, then they wouldn't have been teaching heresies and Gnosticism and led people astray. And I am almost 100% sure that that's also what Jude is talking about here, that there are these people who were doing this. They would come into these churches and they would preach this false gospel, and then they would end up kind of leading people astray through that, because they would usually, what they would do is they would target catechumens. So they would be kind of pulling catechumens off to the side and telling them, like, yeah, this stuff, what the church is saying is true and whatnot, but also check out this story about the pleroma and this mystical interpretation of stuff Jesus said. And we also have this document called Thomas where it talks about this. And this comes from Thomas, actually, by the way. Like, so they're just making stuff up. I mean, I know that the Gospel of Thomas doesn't come until later, and like all of the false gospel things, they don't come until later. But my point is that this is how they operated. They would set up camp within a church and then try to pull people away. And so that's what he's talking about in that passage, is that these people are actually like directly trying to subvert the church from within. I think that's what's going on in that passage. Nicola, if you have any more details about that passage, or if you know and I'm just totally off base here thinking about something else, feel free to correct me.
No, nothing to correct. I just went quickly while you were talking, trying to read through Jude 1. I mean, it only has one chapter. I
Mm-hmm.
think that contextually speaking, these are like normal, regular human beings who are deceived and deceiving others. They're false prophets. They're wicked people following their own flesh. They're faithless. So, the whole chapter, which has, only 25 verses, is basically giving different attributes to these people. But I don't think I can parallel them with what we read in Gospel of Matthew, that, if they're wicked people planted by Satan in spiritual way, completely, yes. But I was just looking more of something that we were mentioning, maybe like, a hypothesis, like if the devil can actually plant a human being, how would that work? Would it
Right.
be again through this magical religious rite? Would it be maybe through? I know there are different Christian researchers who are not scholars, but they like researching, and their research is leading them to some more scientific or pseudo-scientific answer. How, through playing with the DNA, maybe Nephilim can rise again on the earth. And I don't know much about this, and I don't dare to say that there's anything truthful in this. Is it impossible? I don't know. Is it possible? I don't know, and I don't dare to say yes or no. I will have to read books on that. The reason why I didn't read books on that, because it more seems to me as a pseudoscience than as something
Right.
true. But again, I'm ignorant in that area, and so I would have to buy some books and read from different authors who are way below Dr. Michael Heiser or the priest that you mentioned, who
Mm-hmm.
who are uh, wrestling with the divine counsel from a scholarly perspective, because the priests you mentioned, Dr. Heiser, they all have PhDs, but it's not just that. They were or are reputable people, and books anyone can write and publish. So I'll have to
Right.
see and read, like, okay, in these books where this is assumed that new generation of so-called mutants, let's call them that way,
Yeah.
could it be half demonic, half human? I don't know what is the scholarly source behind that. Is it just a conspiracy hypothesis or something the authors truly believe is happening or will happen? I don't know. I'll have to research. Um, Thank you for that book. God is a man of war, the young. I'll have to order that book. But before we go back to Plato, I think we didn't talk about Plato for like 30 minutes. I want to say one more thing, Kevin. Maybe 10, 15 minutes ago, when Sean asked the question about the king and he's bad, and you mentioned this passage, I was thinking immediately about Psalm 22, which is a messianic psalm, where the whole land was mentioned in King Og. But this passage is very interesting because it says, "Many bulls surround me; strong bulls of Bashan encircle me." Now, if you are like I used to be until just a year ago, very ignorant that this passage could mean something spiritual, if I would just read that passage isolated from its cultural and historical background, from anything spiritual, I would just like, okay, this is an unusual passage, and I would think that bulls are just a regular,
Mm-hmm.
type of animal, just bulls, and that's it. And I would just go and continue reading further. But with this context of King Og and everything we'll be reading, we can see that because this was a messianic psalm, right? So it was talking about Jesus. We are actually
Right.
seeing what we don't know now, because again, the church on the West has lost this supernatural aspect, that Jesus was wrestling with the powers of darkness, with the demonic entities, and
Exactly.
kind of like this fallen Elohim, small e, deities and gods. And when he says this bulls of Bashan have encircled me, so in a spiritual way, he it could have mean that this is why I learned, and this is what I'm leaning now, that Jesus was surrounded by these demonic foes who were surrounding him, but of course he overcame them. Now we can dedicate a whole episode how he overcame them. Was it in the harrowing of hell? Probably where he was between 3 days when he died and resurrected. He was subduing these forces. He was defeating the Satan, taking the key of Hades, ascending and taking the saints with himself. Sherman and some other people were my guests several months ago when we dedicated 2 episodes on the harrowing of hell, and they explained this in great lengths. So I don't want to dwell on that. I just wanted to mention Psalm 22, especially verse 12, because you and Sean mentioned it. I'm like, this is a cool,
Mhm.
addition to what you guys have been talking. That those bulls of Bashan, knowing that King Og was not a regular human being, brings another supernatural aspect that we should not
Right.
forget. And the whole
And
Bible
it
is filled with those little things that if we
exactly.
don't know, we can just read and think and assume in our 21st century American mindset or European or whatever. Oh, it just, that's just a bull, it's just an animal, and go further down. But it actually has weight and has depth
It
that the ancients
does.
knew,
It
but we don't
does.
know.
And he mentions Bashan, you're spot on. He mentions Bashan to call us back to the story of Og of Bashan because the specific deity that Og was connecting himself to was, a bull deity. And so it is calling us back to that story, and it is showing us that he's in engaged on the cross. He is engaged in battle with the demonic powers. Saint Athanasius says that Christ ascended the cross because Satan is described as the prince of the power of the air, and so on the cross he's able to do battle with Satan in Satan's territory, the territory of the air. So he's ascended so that he can do battle, and doing battle in the air, he conquers Satan in the air. And so yes, it's on the cross that Jesus defeats. I think the harrowing of hell is important, but I don't think I think the harrowing of hell is a result of Jesus's victory. I think Jesus's victory happens the moment that he dies on the cross, because he is the one whom death cannot conquer. So he gives himself freely to death, and in doing so destroys the power of death, because death cannot hold him and has no authority over him as God. And as God entering into the place of death, he now has robbed death of its authority to hold those who are his, and so he removes them from Hades. So yeah, you said you didn't want to go on a big thing on that, but I did just want to say that I think it's actually the moment of death is where he destroys the power of death, and that means that is his victory, so to speak. So his victory happens on the cross, and that's why this is being described this way, because it's like he is engaged in battle on the cross, and that's something we don't usually think about. We think of Jesus on the cross as well, you probably don't want to get into like the penal substitution stuff, so I'll just say that oftentimes we think of Jesus on the cross as like getting beat up by his dad so that you don't have to. And I completely don't think that's what's going on. I think Jesus is at war on the cross, and that he's the conquering king on the cross. Both the suffering servant and the conquering king, those are the same reality. Just one is the reality of appearances, and one is the reality that happens behind the curtain. And that's what the book of Revelation is doing. The book of Revelation, the reason why it's called apocalypse means revelation. It's revealing the gospel the way it really happened. So Jesus is the lamb who is slain. That is true. But that lamb is a conquering lion. When we pull back the curtain, that lamb is the lion who destroys the power of hell. Anyway, you said you didn't want to do a big thing on it, so I apologize. I shouldn't I shouldn't go on a big thing anyway. Go ahead with your next point.
Yeah. So we're almost done with the account that Critias wrote. Actually, I was about to say Paul. Plato wrote through what he heard from his second cousin Critias. Okay. In the center was a shrine sacred to Poseidon and Cleito, so his wife, the human wife, surrounded by a golden wall through which entry was forbidden. as it was the place where the family of the 10 kings was conceived and begotten. And there, year by year, seasonal offerings were made from the 10 provinces to each one of them. There was a temple of Poseidon himself, a state in length, 300 feet wide and proportionate in height, though somewhat outlandish in appearance. The outside of it was covered all over with silver, except for the figures on the pediment, which were covered with gold. Inside, the roof was ivory picked out with gold, silver, and very interesting. This is important. Now I'm going to try to pronounce it. Orichalc. No one knows how to pronounce this because this was a mysterious metal back in the days that some scholars don't believe truly exists, but we'll get back to that. So with gold, silver, and orichalc, and all the walls, pillars, and floor were covered with orichalc. Now, in this account that Plato describes, I just want to add this: the island of Atlantis was almost like a Dini garden. Like almost everything was ideal for life. I don't remember reading about their civil wars. I don't remember about them protesting on the streets. I don't remember them killing themselves. Like everything was very well organized. There was a big number of flora and fauna. They had elephants. They had a lot of water. The land was so fertile. So it seems like it's an ideal place on the planet to pick where you want to dwell, where you want to live. And they had this mysterious ore or metal called orichalc that other civilizations supposedly didn't have. Okay. Um, it contained gold statues of the gods standing in a chariot drawn by 6 winged horses. And this is another biblical parallel. Okay, six-winged horses. Now, how is this relatable to the Bible? Well, I'm immediately thinking of the cherubim, right? Isaiah 6 says the seraphim have 6 wings, as well as Ezekiel 1 and 10. But unfortunately, unlike Isaiah 6, Ezekiel 1 and 10, they say the cherubim have 4 wings and 4 faces. But still, regardless of that, we know that at least Isaiah mentions 6 wings. And now we are reading in the account of Atlantis that Plato is recording that, this place that belonged to Poseidon, it contained gold statues of the gods standing in a chariot. And I'm thinking of Baal, and I'm thinking also on God as the God of war, who is, again, through these polemics, taking these attributes to himself as the God of war and God of gods. So he's portrayed in a chariot drawn by 6 winged horses. And this is very interesting because we know that in different ancient Near East mythologies and religions, they also had cherubim. They didn't call them cherubim, but they had their own creatures that resembled biblical, especially Old Testament creatures of seraphim and cherubim. They just called them differently, but in many times they were described in the same fashion. Now we see this in Atlantis, which was a sort of Greek civilization. Very interesting. Very interesting. So tall that his head touched the roof, and round him, riding on dolphins, 100 Nereids, that being the accepted number of them at the time. Round the temple were statues of the original 10 kings and their wives, and so on and so on. I just want to read that. I'm almost done with this account. Now let me skip to the last section, which is talking about political and legal authority. I just want to show that this land, this civilization was ordained in a seemingly very good way. Their arrangements for the distribution of authority and office were the following. Each of the 10 kings had absolute power. I know this seems very, in a way, like a tyrant, but it seems that people did not protest because they saw this divine authority given by Poseidon. So, like, seemingly they were happy. So each of the 10 kings had absolute power in his own region and city, over persons and in general over laws, and could punish or execute at will. So, woe to you if you did not live righteously or appeasing to this king, which was a semi-deity, right? But the distribution of power between them and their mutual relations were governed by the injunctions of Poseidon, enshrined in the law and engraved by the first kings on an, again, this orichalc pillar in the temple of Poseidon in the middle of the island. Here they assembled alternatively every fifth and sixth year, consulted on matters of mutual interest, and inquired into and gave judgment on any wrong committed by any of them. And before any prospective judgment, they exchanged mutual pledges in the following ceremony. They were in the temple of Poseidon, bulls roaming at large. Again, we come to bulls. The 10 kings, after praying to the gods, after praying to their father Poseidon, that they might secure a sacrifice that would please him, entered alone and started a hunt for a bull using clubs and nooses, but no metal weapon. And when they caught him, they cut his throat over the top of the pillar so that the blood flowed over the inscription. And on the pillar were engraved, in addition to the laws, an oath invoking awful curses on those who disobeyed it. When they had finished the ritual of sacrifice and were consecrated the limbs of the bull, they mixed a bowl of wine and dropped in a clot of blood for each of them before cleansing the pillar and burning the rest of the blood. After this, they drew wine from the bowl in golden cups, poured a libation over the fire, and swore an oath to give judgment in accordance with the laws given on the pillar, to punish any past offenses, never knowingly in future to transgress what was written, and finally neither to give nor obey orders unless they were in accordance with the laws of their father. Okay, I'll stop reading here. Wow. Okay, so again, we see very Old Testamentish sacrifices, altar, blood of the bulls, similar to Yahweh, but this is dedicated to Poseidon. So we see something that is copied. When I say copied, I don't mean that the ancient Greeks took this literally from the Old Testament, but the same ritual was taken from something older, so from the people of God, but not for Yahweh. It was done to Poseidon. It never says that Poseidon then further gave glory to Yahweh. No, he would just take it for himself. And even though it's noble that his sons, the 10 kings, wanted to judge righteously and would give oath, even to the point of like the curse would come back if they would judge unrighteously. But that righteous judgment was ultimately judged by Poseidon. There was no higher authority than him, at least in Atlantis. So again, I'm thinking, even though we don't know much what was happening between Deuteronomy 32 and Psalm 82, bam, like first, none of them give praise to Yahweh, the God of the Bible.
That's right.
One true creator. And second, who is to say that even though, let's say, hypothetically speaking, if they had good intentions and tried to judge righteously, they actually obeyed and fulfilled what Yahweh would give all these deities allotted to different nations? What if they were judging unrighteously? Because first we have to remember, even if they had some good intentions and laws, which I have to believe they had, because it cannot be that, if we disagree with someone, like we will think, oh, they're the most horrible people ever. Like even with Hitler, we can find some probably good attributes, like he loved children, he loved animals, whatever. Like just because we disagree with someone or don't like them, that doesn't mean that we should ascribe the worst of anything to them. No, let's be honest and say, this was good, this was wrong. Okay, so they probably had very good stuff, otherwise their civilization would be ruined long ago. Yet we see from the very beginning, Poseidon did the same thing as the Watchers, the fallen ones, did in Genesis 6, and procreate with people, and that's how Nephilim came to be. I'm done with reading what Critias was recording. I don't know if you want to just comment on what I was saying, how the whole Atlantis was structured, and how even though they had some good laws, there was no judge higher than Poseidon. So in that way, like, it's very possible that if this entity does exist, that calls itself Poseidon, that God will judge him the same way that he's judging those in Psalm 82.
No, I think you've hit the nail on the head. I think you're exactly right. I thought it was interesting, like you noted, that you've got the bull imagery again here. And I actually I wanted to try to pull up this article that I was going to reference for you, but it doesn't really matter. The article, if I find it, I'll send it to you later and you can link it in the bottom or whatever. But it's so archaeologists or I should say, I guess I'll go back a little further. Anthropologists used to claim that religion was something that evolved over time. And what they would try to say is that, well, early people worshipped forces of nature, worshipped like divine beings as forces of nature. And then this got sort of developed into a pantheon, and then this would get developed into monotheism, and then monotheism would get developed into like, Christianity or whatever. Well, we've actually discovered that that's not true. Archaeologists have discovered two things. First is that actually the opposite is true. What we actually find is that most cultures start out with a very rich, very full, and beautiful and impressive theology. Like, for example, the ancient Chinese had just a very deeply and very similar to Christianity theology, very very important to them. And then over time, it gets kind of weirder and weirder, and different things come in. And by the way, the whole thing about worshiping forces of nature, totally made up. Ancient people didn't do that. But I digress from that. So we actually see a devolution of from super ancient religions to later paganism. And what's fascinating, though, is archaeologists have also found that there are these worship sites that do not correlate to anything else, really. The only reason why this site would have existed was for the purpose of worship, which shows that from the first moments that human beings had any sort of civilization, we have always worshipped. But when you get to the point in the archaeology where people are starting to have polytheism, Nicola, can you guess what the first god people start worshiping looks like?
Probably someone like themselves, maybe their divinized ancestor.
Well, it's actually, you're really close. So it's actually a person with a bull head. Almost universally, when people start, maybe not in like China or Japan, but at least in the Middle East, this is universal, and in a lot of other places too. So there's like tons of examples of this, where the first temple that gets erected to what we would call a false god, it's like a bull. It's a human with a bull head, including ancient Greece. People think ancient Greece, they're like, oh, the Greek gods always looked like people. That's not true. The earliest depictions we have of the Greek gods, they look a lot more like the Egyptian gods, where they're like people with animal heads, and Zeus has the head of a bull and Hera has the head of a cow. And there's even a reference to that in Homer, where I think it's Odysseus prays to Hera, and he calls her, "O cow-eyed Hera." And it's a reference to this more ancient practice of portraying their gods with animal heads. So I didn't mean for that to be such a long tangent. I just wanted to share that because once again, we see this imagery of these bulls in Atlantis, and I think that's really significant. And then the only other thing I was going to contribute to that is, you rightly pointed out that Poseidon isn't giving glory to Yahweh. And I would also point out that, Plato is saying that the Atlantean kings were judging justly and that they were so righteous and all of this. But we should remember that, he's not getting this from the Bible. He's getting this from the mythology that is given to them so this is from the demonic propaganda. So that the demons are saying, yeah, our guys ruled really well and you guys were happy under our rulership. I'm not sure how seriously I take that. Like, maybe it's true. Maybe they were righteous. Like, we do have examples of some ancient kings who really were very righteous men despite being pagan. And so I'm not saying it's impossible, but I am saying that I'm not going to take their word for it just because just because their propagandists say they did a good job. I'm not going to necessarily buy that they did. And
Yeah,
that
I
was
just
all I
want to
was going
add.
to add to that.
I wanted to add on that again, just because we may disagree with something or someone, that doesn't mean we should discredit them completely. I'm reminded,
Exactly.
yeah, I'm reminded of the ancient Gentile pagan rulers who tried to really rule justly. Like Hammurabi's law was
Yes.
regarded to be maybe not on the same level as Moses's law, but it was still concerned to be a decent one, in some places very good one. So like, hey, if that was truthful and it worked well for the people of that time, that they felt less oppressed and maybe more appreciated, good for them. It was, even though this was thousands of years ago. So yeah, I mean, yeah,
Exactly.
there's no reason for me to discredit something or someone just because I'm not them, or I don't share the same worldview or mythology or belief. Yeah. The last question for this segment again comes from Sean. Is the Bible relating Babylon to Atlantis shortly? No.
Yeah. No. Yeah, he's referencing, he even puts it here, Revelation 17 verse 12, the 10 horns are 10 kings. No, I don't think. The closest thing I might say is, like, it's possible that there's a universal history thing happening where this is a recurring theme, but I would have to study that more to even see if I discern that. But I really don't think he's making a reference to Atlantis specifically, just because they both have 10. So,
Yeah, I agree. Okay, we came almost to the end of this first book. So the introduction and the appendix was written by Desmond Lee, at least in this version of the copy that I have. It came out by the late 70s. And this is important because some of the things he's not attacking, but wrestling with Plato's account as a skeptic, we will see that later, archaeological findings found the opposite. But let me read what Desmond Lee, as a, I think he was a scholar. I don't know much about him. Let's read some of his some of the pages where he mentioned it, why is he skeptical when it comes to Plato's Atlantis. Um, Okay, he's giving a few reasons. He said the first one is that the Greeks had a bad sense of time. This is what the Egyptian priest in Timaeus means when he says, "You Greeks are all children." Greek tradition and Greek memory are, as he explains, comparatively short. Okay. Then he mentions another Plato's work. He says the idea of degeneration, because this started happening by the end of the account of in Critias, which I don't know if everyone knows, but Critias suddenly stops recording, and Plato does do the same because the story is not over. Basically, these gods, these rulers, start paying attention more to themselves and being supposedly less divine and more human-like. So Zeus comes and judges them. Okay, so this is the end of Critias's and thus Plato's report of Atlantis. So in that regard, Desmond Lee says that the idea of degeneration of these gods, right, of these beings that we meet also in the Republic, Book 7, which was authored by Plato, the idea of cyclic repetition in the politics. And in the Timaeus, again, we have the notion of periodic destructions by natural cataclysms, followed by a slow development of civilization, a notion that recurs once more in Aristotle. So basically, he's saying that he's not, Desmond Lee right, who wrote the introduction in the appendix of the book, he says that he's not so sure when it comes to the Plato's account how accurate it is, because first, this could be bad timing, and or Plato already mentioned some of the similar things in his famous work Republic. There's like this um, periodic distraction, again happening by natural cataclysms, and surprise surprise, this is also happening in Atlantis. So he's starting to doubt, and that's fine. The second point Desmond Lee makes is that Plato was always plagued by the context and conflict of the ideal and the real. Again, in the Republic as well as in Atlantis, we don't always know what is true and what is mythical in regard to, like, hey, this sounds so amazing, this place, these people, this civilization. It's almost like the Garden of Eden. But is it true? How much of this is true and how much Plato added to it so it can seem like, oh, this is an amazing place where you want to move your
Mhm.
family and live? So again, Desmond Lee says that we simply don't know. He says the Timaeus gave the religious and philosophical background. The Critias, so the second guy in the book, he gives a version of the earlier history. Um, I want to skip a lot because we went too far for tonight. Um, okay, he says that first, the alleged origin of the story. Critias says that he heard it from his grandfather, who in turn had it from Solon, who heard it when he was abroad on his travels in Egypt. Like we heard, he heard it from the Gentile priest. So he said, while this is chronologic, it is chronologically possible, but if you put the dramatic date of the dialogue at about 425 BC. I don't have time to read everything, but now this is what triggers me a little bit. Another point of why he's doubting this story, he says the account starts with pure myth. When the gods divide up the earth between them, the Atlantis falls to Poseidon. Okay, so I can understand him as a skeptical scholar, why he would doubt this. But then again, if we're accepting the same pattern, uh, the same form of judging if something's true or not, just by like, oh, this is garbage, this is mythical, just because it mentions gods, then we can discard easily the Old Testament, saying, well, the Bible mentions in Deuteronomy 32 the very same thing. So this is why I put question marks, so I would remember to mention this. So with this kind of objection, I can't agree. But with the previous one, when it comes to dating, how much Plato added, I can only say, well, it makes sense. But again, what was true, we may never know. Okay. Then he also mentions number 3. As the third objection he gives. If I can just find it, that would be amazing. Okay, so he goes on to explain these circles and saying how the circles described in Atlantis, uh, they seem like too amazing, and there's something in the cosmos, in the philosophy of that time, the circles could represent. There's a lot of stuff that I underline here that I just don't have time for tonight to read, but basically he's putting some of the objections when it comes to those things as well. And then he ends his appendix saying that then we deal with all these objections. He says, well, replies can be grouped into 3 categories. The crazy. There is no doubt that a preoccupation with the Atlantis often leads to a certain craziness, and you have to be on the lookout for this even in the works of apparently serious scholarship. Number 2, the second type of reply can be called the geological. This attempts to keep within the bounds of fact by producing scientific evidence for the existence of the Atlantic continent at some earlier phase in the Earth's history. There is a raised ridge in the Atlantic running from Iceland to the South Atlantic and surfacing at the Azores, Ascension Island, and Tristan da Cunha, trying to pronounce this, as some geologists have held that these are the remains of a land bridge between Europe and America. But the geologists are not agreed. The timescales don't fit easily. Legends of lost cities can be accounted for by known and comparatively minor shifts of coastline and sea level. And lastly, so we come to the third type of answer, the historical. First, how serious is Plato in his story about Solon and the Egyptian priests? Taylor, who spent a lifetime, I guess this is another scholar, he spent the whole lifetime trying to prove that every word Plato wrote was historically based, rather surprisingly says that we could hardly be told more plainly than we are by Plato's narrative that the whole story is a fiction. This made me disappointed, honestly. Yet, it is precisely in this sort of detail, date, setting, relative ages, personalities, that Plato is often at his most realistic. The sequence between Solon, Drapides, to Critias, Critias's grandfather, to Critias as the grandson, and then Plato, is though chronologically possible. So he gives so many reasons why to doubt, and then some. I think he's, even though he's skeptic, he's still trying to say, well, there could be some of these things that that there are true, but again, he's like doubting. But there could be some historical narrative that was accurate, on which Plato built and added on. And I mean, this person was way more knowledgeable than me, so I don't dare to, in that way, refute him because I don't know. But with this thing, I for sure disagree. Well, actually, with two things. The first thing, when he says the account starts with pure myth, just because they're gods allotted to nations. But the second thing, again, this was written in by the end of the 70s, right? So more than 45 years ago. He says there's a completely unknown and imaginary metal mentioned by Plato, orichalc. And I will read in this book that the archaeologists in the meantime had found the metal to exist. So when this guy was writing by the end of 70s, they didn't know. But then when this book came to be only several years ago, they did found the metal. So before I go there, is there anything you would like to comment briefly, maybe on what Desmond Lee summarizes in the appendix?
Um, no, I would say that one thing I liked, you pointed out that he says the Greeks had a bad sense of time, but then he talks about this degeneration, and he says, well, Plato talks about this elsewhere. And so he kind of makes this assumption that therefore it's not true. But the thing is that I don't think that necessarily proves that it's not true, because that's what's called begging the question. He's assuming that Plato is wrong about this idea of degeneration in politics, and therefore, if Plato is telling this, it can't possibly be true. What if instead part of the reason why Plato believes in a degeneration in politics, whether or not we believe that that's a true concept, what if part of the reason he believes that is precisely because there are historical accounts where it happens? One of them may be Atlantis. So I'm not going to say that, like, oh, well, because Plato believes in this concept and then relates some history that would involve this concept, that must mean it's false. That's begging the question, because you're assuming that it's false, but you haven't demonstrated that that's a false premise. I'm not saying I agree with Plato about degeneration in politics. I'm just saying that's not a good faith way of trying to refute someone. But then what I thought was more interesting is, okay, let's look at this concept of degeneration playing out in the Atlantis myth. And we see in the beginning, these people and their god rule righteously and do good, but over time they become more and more evil and less like gods, and then they have to be judged. Well, to me, that sounds exactly like Deuteronomy 32 and Psalm 82. God appoints the nations to be ruled by these sort of vice regents, and then those vice regents rule in an evil way. They don't give honor to God. They accept worship from the people, and so Psalm 82, God judges them. God comes and says that they arise, O God, for to thee belong the nations. So God shows up and he says, "You have not judged righteously. You have not done what I commanded you to do." So to me, this sounds, this is just yet another biblical parallel. And I don't think, like you said, I don't think Desmond makes a very good case against Plato's account here, precisely because it just the kinds of arguments he's using are philosophically flawed arguments, and then his assumption that the degeneration thing couldn't have happened because Plato talks about it elsewhere seems to me to be thoroughly refuted just by the fact that this this particular degeneration, I'm not saying that all degenerations have to be true, but this particular degeneration makes a lot of sense with a biblical framework. So I'm willing to go to bat at least a little bit for Plato. I'm not going to say that I have, a smoking gun, but I am willing to go to bat that I don't think Plato has been refuted in any way.
Yeah, before I start going, before I go to another book, I just want to say that it's very interesting how the account of Critias given to Plato when it comes to the generation of the further rulers that came eventually, uh, they were judged by Zeus, who sent the flood. Very interesting. Another biblical parallel, but it's just the different name of the different deity put into perspective. Okay. I want to say that so the Desmond doubted that this ore existed because we have no evidence that this mythical ore was anywhere found, and supposedly it only existed on the island of Atlantis. Now, when you go, I'm on the worldhistory.org, and actually they did find this ore. Okay, I'll just read a couple of sentences. Orichalcum, or called differently mountain copper, was a metal used in coins during ancient times. Orichalcum was a golden yellow colored mixture consisted of both copper and zinc and referred to as brass. The Romans were the first to make coins from orichalcum and were attracted to the metal due to its close resemblance to gold. According to the Greek philosopher Plato, who lived around from 428 to around until 347 BC, orichalcum was only second in value to gold. Ancient writers were at odds over whether or not orichalcum was a natural ore or made up from different metals. Now it goes all in description and etymology. There's a photo. There's this ore is not a pure imagination. It says that it was a metal that closely resembled gold, although its value was inferior. It was described as being the color of fire, usually a dark yellow or reddish tinted yellow. Although ancient writers disagree over the chemical makeup of orichalcum, modern studies, not modern myths, have shown that most orichalcum was made up out of from 80% copper and 20% zinc, with small amounts of lead, tin, and other metals being detected. Okay, so this is another way to show that all kudos to Desmond Lee. Some of his final conclusions may be very valid. That the story over the time became legendary with many additions. I have no problem with that. But it's another thing to speculate that everything mentioned was pure myth, pure legend. Like I just
Right.
wanted to disagree with that. Okay, so we are done with this book. I'll just briefly go through some of this book written by Dr. Sean Welsh, and I would lie if I would wholeheartedly recommend this book because it was written by a Christian researcher who is a medical doctor. So this book is not written by a scholar who is familiar with history. He was just researching from his point of view and wanted to write a book that, in his understanding, is pointing to the island of Santorini. And for those who don't know, Santorini is a small island on the south of Greece. It's above Crete. It's above Crete and way smaller. But this is for Dr. Welsh. This was his understanding. that Atlantis is basically the island of Santorini. Okay, so I'll go first with page 15. He's trying to give one of the alternative hypotheses, even though he's rooting and cheering for Santorini to be Atlantis. He's mentioning my favorite place that I would love if Atlantis is actually this place. And it's placed in the northern Mauritania, which is northwest part of Africa. And he's saying that this is the most plausible explanation for the existence of Atlantis in North Africa. This structure is a 23-mile wide geological formation. It all comes in circles. You can see the satellite photos online. And it's arranging concentric circles in the most remote parts of the desert. The structure is located some 400 miles from the Atlantic Ocean. However, linear striations in the sand surrounding the formation show that tsunami activity affected the region some 12,000 years ago. The rigid structure, or the Eye of Sahara, is consistent with Plato's Atlantis in a number of ways. First, the structure almost exactly matches the physical dimensions of Plato's Atlantis, accounting for transcription errors in the text. The geophysical morphology of the structure consists of elevated circular ground separated by less elevated depressions, giving the appearance of water-filled canals separating concentric circles of land. Now, I have a question for you, Kevin, before I go to another page. Have you seen the images from the satellite from these so-called circles? It just looks like out of this world. I wish they invest more money to go and dig so we can actually see this. I was listening to the scientific explanation. They say, well, yeah, it is unusual, it is beautiful, it looks like legendary or mythical, but it's basically just natural made from erosion. So I don't know what your research led you. Could you think that there could be some truth between relation of Atlantis and the Eye of Sahara?
Definitely. So I would point out that they say it's natural erosion, but like you said, they haven't really investigated that claim. But more importantly, I would point out that that area used to be ocean. It's actually only so that part of the North Africa used to actually have a lot more waterways and a lot more rivers and oceans. It used to have a lot more like lakes and things too, and was much more forested, more like inland Africa is. So it wasn't always desert like it is now. So that's one thing that we should know when we talk about this, is that it's actually very plausible that there was like ocean there and that this was a waterway, and that's what is being described. So I definitely think that could be, and I think that has a high degree of likelihood that is, especially since, it's an Egyptian priest telling the story. There's a lot of details that seem to make it line up. So yeah, I agree with you. I would be super excited if they would do some archaeological digs there and look into it some more.
Okay, now Dr. Welsh is moving from, potential places that could be, he doesn't mention just the Eye of Sahara in Africa. He's mentioned plethora of different places that, scientists, researchers over the time were guessing like what could be the real Atlantis. So for him, he made up his mind, it's Santorini for sure. So now we're moving to that part where he's trying to prove. He said Santorini is an active volcano. He's trying to give the geographical background so we can understand why, what was the reason that the lost civilization, the civilization of Atlantis was lost and destroyed. So he said Santorini is an active volcano. It sits at the center point of the South Asian volcanic arc. Okay. Its prominent location at the center of this volcanic arc is the reason for Santorini's explosive power. It was, after all, responsible for the largest volcanic eruption in recorded history, the Thera eruption of 1600 BC. Okay, that's page 32. Let's go to page 44. So he's giving some geographical reasons and natural reasons why he thinks, Santorini is the place. This is the second reasoning. He says in Plato's dialogues, Atlantis was described as larger than Libya and Asia Minor. This would seem to imply that the island of Atlantis should be significantly larger than Santorini by orders of magnitude. However, there is a simple explanation for this confusion. In ancient Greek, the word for larger than was meson, while the word for between was meson. So the only difference is between Z and S. In the author's view, so in his own view, it is likely that a transcription error was responsible for describing Atlantis as larger than Libya and Asia Minor
Mm,
instead of between Libya and Asia Minor. Okay? Then he goes to another mistake we make nowadays because according to him, we fail to understand, some of the words or measurements from the ancient times. He says, what about Plato's description of Atlantis having existed 9,000 years before the time of Solon? How can we reconcile this to the Thera eruption? Again, a transcription error is likely to blame. The ancient Greek numeric system had little use for large numbers because they were not germane to daily life. The ancient Greeks wrote the number 900 as we would today. However, they wrote the number 9,000 as 900 exponent 1. Very interesting. We can see, therefore, that it is highly plausible that this would create confusion. Many people began to think that Atlantis existed 9,000 years ago before Solon's time, when in fact it existed 900 years before Solon's time. He also says this, taking Plato's, so here he's dealing with age, but now let's go with the measurements of the island. He says, taking Plato's description at face value, the island of Atlantis should measure 340 miles long by 230 miles wide. However, the huge artificial inflation of Plato's Atlantis in comparison to the real Atlantis, in his view Santorini, was caused by a transcription error. Greek numbers over 1,000 were written with an exponent 1 instead of a third zero. So, for example, in Plato's time, the number 3,000 would have been written 300 exponent 1 instead of 3,000, as we should write it today. This likely caused an error in the interpretation of the true size of the island of Atlantis that was propagated throughout the centuries. Using a much more realistic 300 stadia long by 200 stadia wide for the dimensions of the island, Plato's description would reflect a true size of 34 miles long by 23 miles wide. And guess what? That's the size of Santorini Island. So I'm like, wow, okay. I'm not saying that this guy, has solved the mystery, but at least when it came to this point, how the ancient Greeks used to put huge numbers when they had 4 digits instead of the last zero,
right.
they would like just use exponent 1. Like then the supposedly for him, the measurements of the island and the age of Atlantis fits much more modern history and a smaller island like Santorini. So, do you have any opinion about this, or I can just continue reading further?
You can just continue reading. I think this is awesome. I do have something to contribute to this aspect of the discussion, but I want you to finish what you're the point you're making first. So keep going.
Okay, then he's also mentioning, this is so interesting. He's mentioning this ore or metal, orichalcum. He said they found it out in the meantime in 2015. And I was thinking, this is amazing because it just confirms what I found out in a secular website. Okay, now let's switch to the cult of Poseidon. This is why the author thinks that it makes sense that Santorini, as belonging to Greece and Greek civilization, was Atlantis. He says the gods of ancient Greece and the gods of Atlantis were very similar. The deistic pantheons of Greece and Atlantis are substantially identical. For example, the founder and patron god of Atlantis was said to be Poseidon, the Greek god of the sea. Okay, very interesting. We see already more similarities. Now let's switch to page 78. I see that you've been corresponding with one of the guests in a dialogue. Okay, page 78. Okay. And this is the page where I disagree with him. He says the third eruption of 1600 BC ended the Pax Atlantica and a dark age in the Mediterranean region. The Atlantean Empire had been all but destroyed. Her people, scattered throughout the Mediterranean, morphed into a new nomadic seafaring ethnic group known to history only as the Sea Peoples. And this is where I think he's wrong. He says around 1500 BC, some of the Sea Peoples, so the peoples from the destroyed Mediterranean civilization, tired of a life of piracy, decided to lay down roots in Palestine, in the region now known as the Gaza Strip. These descendants of Atlantis would later become known as the Philistines and develop into the modern-day Palestines. When I check this information online, it just shows that it's false. They say there should be no correlation between the Philistines and the Palestines. Yeah. Why am I reading this? This may not be super important to make a conclusion, but I just want to say how at the very beginning of the introduction of this book, Dr. Sean Welsh, he admits, I'm a medical doctor. Nothing in this book is written from that perspective as if I'm a scholar when it comes to history or something. He's a medical doctor who's been researching. So this is my point. Is one thing to listen to scholars, such as Dr. Michael Heiser, and someone who is maybe like you and me, researching, writing. We may be true, we may have some good points, but we also may come up to the wrong conclusions. So this is why we should not just blindly believe any source. Okay, I'm almost done with this book. So he makes that thing that I was like, I don't think this is true. A couple more details, and I'm trying to be done. Okay, I think here he's not being intellectually honest. And why? While he has a good point about Greek numerical system, right? This is where I would disagree with him. He says the novel dating methodology we propose begins with the approximate year of birth of Noah, which we give as 1660 BC. First, who is we? You're the only one writing the book. Again, 1660. Well, Noah lived before Abraham, and conservative Christians take the date of Abraham living 2000 years BC. So Noah couldn't live in 1660 unless you're super liberal a scholar and somehow came up with that conclusion. So I think he's moving those days so he can make the point, as his title is saying, subtitle, how Noah's flood destroyed Atlantis. And I think that Noah's flood happened way before Atlantis. If Atlantis happened about 1600 BC, I believe that the flood happened easily 1,000 or 2,000 years, or God knows how long before that. So I don't like that he's trying, in order to prove his theory, that he's trying to change the days. And he says, again, which we give, even though he's one author, as 1660 BC, based on the fact that the Bible implies that that he was an elderly man by the time of the Great Flood. Okay, I disagree. And the last page where I disagree is, again, when he gives dates, I never heard about these dates. He says, even if we do not accept the exact age of Moses given in the Bible, meaning the experts, we can at least deduce that he was elderly at the time of the Exodus. Therefore, for simplicity, it seems that clear that Moses was born around 800 BC. I'm like, dude, like 800 BC? No, that's too late. So there are like a couple of things that threw me off when I was reading, just in order for him to prove that was Santorini and it was destroyed by biblical flood. He's playing with the dates of Noah. He's playing with the dates of Moses. So these were like a couple of things that I didn't like. And this may not be a fair assessment of the whole book that has, with the appendix, about 80 pages. But because of the lack of time, I just tried to mention some of the things that would be, I think, interesting for today. what else I think that we can mention from this book is that yeah, it's very important that he's revolving his theory that the island of Santorini was destroyed in 1600 BC because of the explosion of the volcano that caused tsunami, and then the
Right.
flood and whatever came. So this is a big deal for him. So it's 1600. At least I'm glad that the very introduction he says, like, I'm prone to mistakes. This is not, this is not to take, to be taken as if God said these things. So I'm glad when it comes to that thing, but I also don't like some things that, like,
Right.
I just wish the dates were more accurate when it comes to the Bible. He says on page 10, I make no pretension that this book is a scholarly or academic work. And I love that he's honest to say, like, what I'm saying here, that doesn't mean it's like yes and amen. So this is very shortly when it comes to this book. He also says, I'm fully aware that many professional archaeologists would vehemently disagree with the conclusions presented in this book. So this is why I cannot fully recommend this
Mhm.
book. But again, if you're just curious, you can buy it. It's less than $10 on Amazon. So again, it's not a big deal, but this is the main book that you should buy. And I
Yeah.
can put some of the links. Now, is there anything you would like to add on this?
Yeah, so I am glad that you read some sections from that book, especially regarding the different locations where there have been discussions about being the location of Atlantis, and there's actually a lot more places where discoveries have been made, archaeological discoveries that have led people to think that this could be the location of Atlantis, that these places could be the location of Atlantis. But I actually think that, so I've studied some of these things, and like Nicola said, I don't have like a degree in archaeology per se, so I don't necessarily, like, you can take what I'm saying with a grain of salt, but I have researched this, and the reason why um, the one of the reasons why there's so many different theories for where Atlantis might have been is because there really is good evidence for a lot of these different locations. And in a lot of these different locations, there have been discoveries made that defied expectations. So I share that simply to say that I don't believe that Atlantis was necessarily a one off kind of thing. I think that there were probably within the ancient world multiple cities with similar to Atlantis, maybe even similar way of constructing. So maybe this was something that demonic entities were doing. I don't know, but I do think that there's good reason for us to conclude that that some of these locations are also the sites of ancient cities that were very powerful and that were swept away, either swept away into the sea, or maybe that we've even found locations of places that were like island nations in the time before the flood in the antediluvian world, and that they were destroyed in the flood. Now, I know Nicola mentioned that the Atlantis story we don't think necessarily happened before the flood, but that's not my point. My point is that it's possible that in the world before the flood, there were lots of these cities similar to Atlantis that were practicing the Nephilim ritual, that were doing these things, and that when God destroyed all of these nations, they left behind some degree of evidence. So I don't discount when I see these things. I agree with Nicola. I believe that Atlantis, the most likely locations for it are either of the locations that he mostly talked about, for the specific place that was the Atlantis. But I think that when we talk about all of these different places where major archaeological discoveries have been made, I don't think it's at all absurd to think that those also were places where ancient cities were, even if it's not the Atlantis. So there's one off the coast of Brazil. There's one close to Mexico, which, by the way, the one close to Mexico is actually where we get the word Aztec. So those people didn't call themselves Aztecs. They called themselves Mexica. And the reason scholars call them Aztecs is because the modern nation that's there today is called Mexico, which is spelled with, or Mexico, which is spelled with an X, with an X, which is exactly how the Mexica spelled their name, and it would be too confusing for books to be written that way. So where did we get the word Aztec? Where did scholars get that word? They get that word from the fact that these Mexica referred to themselves as having originally descended from people who came from a place called Azteca. And Azteca was, lo and behold, this very similar place to Atlantis. So there's actually, among fringe scholars, there is actually a lot of people who believe that the Aztecs were descendants of Atlanteans who had escaped before the destruction of the city. I don't know if that's true. I really don't care. My point is that I think there really was a place called Azteca, and maybe it either existed before the flood, or maybe it had a similar series of events to Atlantis and was destroyed. I don't care how it happened. My point is, I don't think we should discount the idea that the Mexica were telling the truth, that there really was this city of Azteca, and that this city really did exist and prosper and really did experience this cataclysmic fall. And I believe it's very possible that this happened either before the flood, or that it happened in the same way that Atlantis happened, because the Bible even says in Genesis 6 that this was happening before the flood and again afterwards. So it's not like these practices were happening before the flood, God wiped out the earth with the flood, and then this all stopped. No, God wiped out the earth with a flood, and then the demons came back and resumed what they were doing again, which is why Babylon happened. So that's just, maybe that's kind of an interesting theory that I have. Maybe that's a little bit fringe for some people, but I really do believe if you study the evidence of all of these different locations and you study the reasons why people have concluded these things about these various cities, I do believe that there's some really good evidence in world mythology and in archaeology to back up the idea that Atlantis wasn't the only ancient city, that ancient island city that was very prosperous and very powerful, that ultimately received just judgment from God and was sank into the ocean. And I'd also venture to say that it's not that shocking that ancient island nations could rise to prominence, and then, obviously, even if you're not a Christian, even if you're a secular person, if there were a bunch of ancient island nations that were exerting power, and then you assume that maybe a volcano went off and buried them or something, like what happened in Pompeii, like, even if you're a secularist, you could easily assume that, some of these places that have been destroyed throughout history could have been very powerful before their destruction. So I don't think that that's at all absurd. And I definitely think there's a lot of good evidence to suggest that these places exist or existed. And so that's a theory that I've been cultivating. I don't know how many people would agree with me on that, but I guess the reason why I bring that up is just because I see a lot of people debate this issue, and they'll be like, well, Atlantis was in this place, or it was in this place, and they throw out these pieces of evidence, and I don't think we necessarily need to debate it as like it has to have been this place or this place. I think it's a much more compelling case to say, look how many places that are similar to what Atlantis must have been like existed in the ancient world. I wonder if these places existed before or after the flood. I wonder what their stories are. I wonder how this affected the world in a time before most of us have a lot of knowledge about. And so that's a really interesting thing that I love to speculate about and love to think about. And again, I love coming on this show because I enjoy this kind of thing and I enjoy this kind of discussion.
Thank you. Likewise. Okay, I'll try to do something that is not fair to the author of this book because we went far ahead that we planned, and I want to respect everyone's time. So this book, unlike the previous one, was written by a scholar. I don't think he was a Christian, but still, that doesn't matter. His last name is Zanger, and the book is called The Flood from Heaven. I'm just going to read a few stuff, and we can comment on them, and then we can give the concluding thoughts and be done. He says, for example, although Plato realized the secondary nature of the account, which he received from those who came before him in his family structure, Plato appears to have been fully convinced of its accuracy. If Plato's suggested transmission is correct, the 2,500-year-old confusion around Atlantis may have been resulted from a simple misunderstanding between two very old men, Solon and the Saitian priest, right? The guy in the Egypt. I mean, not in the Egypt, in Egypt. Who were chatting about history and were not quite able to comprehend the meaning of their stories. Solon was fascinated by the story only because he was misguided. This is again according to the author of this book, Zanger. If he had realized that the priest was speaking about the Trojan War, he would perhaps not have taken notes of the conversation in his diary. Okay. According to my interpretation, Zanger's, the story of Atlantis is largely a description of Troy and its peak period corresponding to Troy 6 around 1300 BC, as observed from a foreigner's perspective. The Greek opponents of the Atlanteans were the Achaeans. Their culture is sketched at its zenith as well. But the demise, accompanied by the earthquake and flood, was also recorded in the account. Sound geological and archaeological observations introduced in this book provide evidence of such natural disasters at the onset of this collapse. These events, however, were limited to the Argive plain, the center of the Mycenaean culture, and by themselves they have not suffered to overthrow a healthy community. And as we know, Troy was a city-state located, you know, in Asia Minor, which is today's Turkey, and it was at one point of time conquered by the Greeks, right? I want to read a few more or several more quotations by him. There are two principal ways to interpret Plato's story of Atlantis. Either it is predominantly an historical account, with presumably some distortions, or it represents fiction probably based in some measure on fact. No one, however, has been able to argue convincingly in which of these two major groups Plato's report belongs. Two major obstacles prevented a plausible interpretation of the Atlantis legend. Firstly, the enormously diverse expertise required to investigate the account, entailing disciplines such as ancient history, philology, archaeology, and paleogeography. And second, the conventional preconceptions and patterns of thought. And he quotes that last one. He also mentions what you mentioned, Kevin, that the lost continent, the supposed lost continent of Atlantis, has been taught by different people to be in different parts of the world. Netherlands, Bahamas, Tunisia, Mongolia, Malta, Iran, Australia, Ceylon, Brazil, Prussia, North and South America, South Africa, Morocco, Nigeria, Portugal, Spain, Greenland, and so on and so on. Wow. Okay. He says at least 1/3 of the authors infer an historic foundation in Plato's report. Most non-believers, so 2/3, however, just consider the account as a fine piece of literature fiction without elaborating on their arguments, frequently admitting that the most obvious reading of the text would be as a factual account. So again, according to this report in this book, 2/3 of the scholars, people who have seriously attacked this issue, they think that this is a fiction. Okay. Atlantis is depicted as a bizarre, even barbaric looking place. Barbaric is put in quotations, where cultic rituals culminated in the brutish cutting up of bulls and the burning of their extremities. And as we said, this, in our view, as people of faith, people who have studied religion and mythologies, this is not an issue for us. On the contrary, if it just supports what we read before, this is not an issue for us to think this is a fiction. Because last week we talked about Cthulhu. That's fiction, even though there's some spiritual resemblances to the forces of dark. But this, this, I don't think it's fictional, at least this aspect, okay?
Right.
He says, Plato regularly used fictitious dialogues incorporating existing people for pedagogic purposes. So he's speaking about Plato's accounts and writings in general. And this is what I read elsewhere before, that Plato used to invent stories for the purpose of sending a message. So he would create some stories that didn't really happen, but he would try to send a certain message through these invented dialogues. Okay. Putting imaginary speeches in the mouth of historic characters was a common exercise in his time, practiced by others as well. Nevertheless, considering Plato's abilities and reputation, he must have been trying to set an example in this technique. Okay. There's this scholar, John Victor Luce, who said Plato's method consists in accumulating materials rather than fabricating them. So this scholar says differently, and he's quoting again in the same book. So John Victor Luce also says that Plato constructs his account from the resources of a well-stocked mind, not some erratic imagination. Okay, so we see scholars who agree and disagree, which is, it's fine. Okay, here goes now in great lengths to explain how the story came to be, how this island is organized, which we already covered before. Again, we cannot cover the book that is 200 pages and more in just a few minutes and do the justice. We're trying. Okay, he says that the third part, or the central part of Critias' account, is usually attributed to the Atlantis legend. It describes the geography of ancient Attica, including its political boundaries and the effect of deforestation and soil erosion. This is only part of the Atlantis account, which most classical scholars accept as reflecting empirical observations by laymen or intellectuals who concern themselves with what we would call natural science. Okay, well, I wouldn't say that either Critias or Plato, right? Did they try to portray something as scientific for the viewers, not for the viewers, for the audience of that time, and for the account of people who would understand the perspective of that time? They wrote as much as they knew, explaining how the island was organized, developed, observing natural resources. They mentioned that the flora and fauna were wealthy, that the soil was rich. But of course, you cannot expect this account to be seen through the eyes of the 21st century science to be on the same level. Like that wouldn't be fair. Like there's like over 2 millennia of difference between us. Okay.
Exactly.
Yeah. And I'm almost done. I mean, I have tons of notes.
You're good.
I don't have time to read them. I'll have to skip. He says there are translations of Plato's Greek text into modern languages. Do these translations really express what Plato meant? He says the uppermost layer, possibly the toughest to penetrate in today's zeitgeist and bias. Plato's story of Atlantis ambiguously states that the Greek civilization was destroyed by simultaneous earthquakes and flood. Yet today's conventional wisdom persistently assumes Atlantis was the victim of these catastrophes. Conventional wisdom also says that a tidal wave could have destroyed the ancient civilization, whereas the account clearly describes the flood as having come down from heaven. So there are about 8 layers of possible distortion concealing the
Hmm.
truth. To reach down to the bottom, the historic truth appears in most cases to be impossible. So he's again leaning, I think, uh, at least partially to those 2/3 of the scholars who think that this account of Plato was just imagination, or there is some layer of truth with a lot of additions over time. Okay. Um, okay, I have to skip a lot, and I'm sorry because I spent so much time reading this book and getting notes. I feel set with myself, but that's okay. Maybe some other time we can spend more time just to this book. Okay. Um,
I mean, don't feel pressure from my end. I'm perfectly happy to go for as long as you want to, so don't worry about it.
yeah, the thing is, when I was covering this material, I only had the book by that medical scholar, which I read fast, and then this book, which I was reading slower, and which is much serious. And then I was
Right,
getting some extra stuff, and I was reading this book, and I'm like, I don't know how we will cover everything in such a short time and to do the justice. So I actually
right.
wrote the material that can be published in a booklet, and like I'm just going through them, and I'm just randomly skipping and trying to read sentences that will be relevant to this to the topic, even though it doesn't do the justice if I'm just reading something out of context.
Right.
Okay, okay, let's say this. Um, Regarding the size of the mysterious island, most translations state that it was larger than Libya and Asia together. We already mentioned this. The Greek text, however, does not use an adjective in this context. Instead, it uses the adverbial idiom to be of greater significance. Okay, so this guy would actually, in a way, agree with the previous guy who's a medical Christian doctor, not a scientist, and say that it doesn't mean that the island was huge. And that helps him because he's trying to build a case that Troy was actually Atlantis, because in a lot of accounts and depictions of these two seemingly different civilizations and parts of the world, they have so many similarities, right? He says one of the translators therefore maintains categorically that Plato uses the expression called the sphere of influence of the kings of Atlantis rather than their territory. Besides, Libya and Asia were differently defined at that time. Asia probably characterized the Near East, including Egypt, while Libya described then known Africa. So, okay, that historical context is important. Okay, now he's going about the kings of Atlantis. Um, okay. Uh, he's mentioning the genealogy of Troy, and the Trojan War consisted of, he's giving all these deities, including Atlas, Electra, different deities. He's now explaining them, giving their characteristics. He's quoting other scholars. Um, Again, he's going to. Okay, let's read this. There are indeed some indications that the name of Atlantis and its inhabitants, the Atlanteans, was used to describe the people of Troy. In 1776, Jacob Bryant published a 6-volume encyclopedia entitled Analysis of Ancient Mythology. I'm trying to skip this. Okay, Bryant, an expert of Homeric Troy, derived the Trojans from Meropians, whom he described as people of great ingenuity and pride, who claimed to be the descendants of the earth-born giant brood. Ooh, interesting. These Meropians,
So
or
we've got more giants.
yeah, these Meropians or Meropida, I don't know what is this, are also named Atlanteans the supposed offspring of Atlas. Oh, okay. The deity Atlas, who was supposedly, if you remember from mythology, he was holding the whole world on his shoulder, right? So
Yeah.
funny how actually this full meaning finds its fulfillment in Christ, because Jesus came to bear the sins of the world, and you see Atlas carrying the planet. Okay. The Trojans were also of this family, and the poet speaking of the foundations of Troy mentioned it as a city of the Meropes. Their history is comprised in that of Dardanus, the founder of Ilium or Troy. So the common opinion is that the city was built by Ilus, the son of Dardanus, who must consequently have been of the same family, a Merope Atlantean. According to Bryant, these Merope Atlanteans settle in the far west as well as in the far east. Thus, we find that whether we inquire in Mauritania or at the Indus, the same names occur. Such traditional
Hmm.
knowledge of Atlanteans west and east of Egypt may have contributed to the confusion of directions in the same story. Bryant arrives at the conclusion that the people of Troy, the Dardanians, were Atlanteans, being the reputed children of Electra. If this was indeed a very ancient name for the Trojans, it would not be surprising to find it used in Egypt, the native land of the Atlantis legend, because the Egyptian had a tendency to apply outdated names to new populations occupying the same area. Okay, I
Hmm.
love this historical context. The subsequent discussion will show that both the Trojans and the Atlanteans were extremely skilled in the sciences, as Brian says, and that they both claimed to be allied to the gods and heroes. Atlantis was governed by a confederation of kings like the Achaean realm. They held sway, quote unquote, over
Hmm.
all of the straits, all parts of the continent and parts of the continent, but also they ruled over a much larger territory, Europe as far as Tyrrhenia and Libya as far as Egypt. The ancient meaning of these geographical names is not well established, as they may have been mistranslated too. Nevertheless, if Atlantis was near the Straits of Gibraltar, its territorial influence in Europe would have ended in the Tyrrhenian Sea without overlapping with the Greek dominion. In both Iliad and Atlantis, the Greeks ascended as the mighty host, and although they were at times deserted by all the others, they overthrew the opponent and gained a magnificent victory. But at a later time, there occurred earthquakes and floods, and one grievous day, a night befell them when the whole body of your warriors was swallowed by the earth. This is a quotation. And the island of Atlantis, in like manner, was swallowed by the sea and vanished.
Hmm.
Wherefore also the ocean at that spot has now become impassable and unsearchable, being blocked by the shoal mud. I read this like a couple of hours ago by a different author, which, well, actually by Plato himself, which the island created as it settled down. Okay, so I think here that Zanger is quoting Plato, because I have quotations, but I don't have the name. Okay. Conventional wisdom believes that Atlantis was destroyed by a single catastrophe and subsequently drowned in the sea. Plato's original text, however, speaks of the ancient Greek civilization, the whole of your warriors, being swallowed by the earth during earthquakes and floods. This tragedy occurred during the single grievous day and night after the warriors had returned from their successful combat at Atlantis. The earthquake at Tyrrhenes coincides with a later period between 1250 and 1200 BC.
Hmm.
Hence, the destruction occurred only a few years or decades after the Trojan War. The earthquake was accompanied by a devastating flood, which literally swallowed up parts of the lower town. All these events, earthquakes, floods, and chronological boundary, coincide with the abrupt commencement of the Achaean decline. The natural catastrophes are clearly attributed to Greece, although Atlantis is said to have disappeared in like manner. Again, this statement corresponds to the events in the Argolid and the Troad, parts of the Tyrant's lower town, which were buried very rapidly during the flash flood, just as any Trojan building in the plain would have been buried by alluvium after the war. there's much more. I'm trying to read. My throat is getting tired and starting to ache. But basically, I would just encourage people to get this book if you're interested to find more scholarly sources, especially coming from some sound history.
Mm-hmm.
Because the previous book, even though it's written by a Christian, I can't recommend it, but this one I can. So the author is giving a lot more data by paralleling uh, the city state of Troy with Atlantis, how they ended up in the same way, and giving historical
Right.
context that we do need. So I wrote, actually, yeah, I took thousands of words from this book to as notes for tonight, but there's no way I can read them. And then he's ending with this account of God's allotting everything, um, and the destruction. He's also saying that Atlantis' divine creator was Poseidon, the god of sea, earthquakes, and horses. Okay.
Mm.
He's saying that according to this legend, Poseidon's children begot an immortal woman settled in Atlantis. We already mentioned this. But in Troy's mythology, the offspring of Zeus and the mortal woman Electra. So I was wrong when I said Electra was a goddess. I didn't know this. So in the Troy's mythology, the offspring of Zeus and the mortal woman Electra were the first inhabitants of the place. Electra herself was a daughter of Atlas. So she was like a semi goddess. Yet
Yeah.
Poseidon was also the patron of Troy and the erector of its walls. The Iliad describes how Poseidon cheated Heracles in a horse trade. Wow. So there's more similarities, but in this way, mythological, similarities when it comes to Atlantis and Troy. And yeah, he's also explaining the plain of Atlantis, how it looked like, and again comparing to Troy. So there's no way I'm going to read all of this. Um, yeah, he's saying Atlantis was just like Troy, placed in the center of a plain surrounded by hills bordering the sea on their other side. The plain is described as being rectangular in shape, which would again apply to the Trojan plain.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, so again and again, there are many similarities. I'll stop reading here because I feel so bad. It takes so much time from you, dear brother. But basically, okay, first we covered Plato. Then we got lost in the biblical accounts and some pagan narratives of mythology, gods, sexual rights, how these beings came to be, bulls of Bashan, which was a wonderful conversation, by the way. So then we finished Plato. Then we start covering how this author is mentioning in his understanding that it could be the Greek island of Santorini that resembles uh, Atlantis, but only if we understood the Greek measurements, right? And he also alters the dates of the flood of Moses of Noah to make more claims for his idea, which I didn't like. And then we have finally this author who is making the claim that, well, actually the way the Atlantis was depicted, it perfectly, or maybe not perfectly, but in a very similar way depicts Troy. So Kevin, you have all the time you want to take for the concluding thought in your understanding. And I know this is a very ungrateful question because even scholars don't know. But in your understanding, uh, could could there could Troy be Santorini? Could Troy? Could Atlantis be Santorini? Could Atlantis be Troy? Or could Atlantis be maybe something different that we didn't mention? What is your opinion when we after covering so many scholars and sources?
Well, I think that author did give some pretty compelling arguments that you shared. So I think it is absolutely plausible that Atlantis could be Troy. There's a lot of crossover there. There's a lot of similarity, and I'd be willing to believe that. I do think that there are some compelling. I like I said before, I think there's some compelling evidence for other powerful, prominent cities that also received destruction and were swept away. But yes, I think that's a very interesting theory, that it would be Troy. And I like that he was able to kind of tie in the idea that, some of the directional things are a bit confusing. And it's like, well, that could be because so many different ancient people were talking about it. And whether it's Troy or not, I definitely think that's probably true, that a lot of the directional confusion is because of people people being confused by the fact that so many different groups are making reference to it. So I don't know that I have anything super compelling. If you wanted to move to closing thoughts, I know you had said that before. I don't really have anything super compelling other than just the studying Atlantis is particularly interesting because we get a glimpse into ancient people. We get a glimpse into the ancient world. We get to examine how much of the ancient world we really don't know that much about. We know a lot about a lot, but there's a lot of things that we really don't know that much about, and that's okay. There's lots of things for us to take an interest in, and it's wonderful to be able to examine these things. And I would just point out that, ancient people didn't really practice fiction in the way that modern people do. So I don't think Plato was writing fiction. It's possible that, like the last author said, it's possible that there was some misunderstanding going on, but it really doesn't matter to the overall point, which is whatever you believe Atlantis is, for us, the most interesting thing as Christians is how much this study of the ancient world reinforces what the Bible is already telling us happened and what we have always believed from Scripture happened, and also external, Book of Enoch type stuff, what that says happened, how this confirms a full, rich biblical interpretation of history. And because of that, we can see how Christ is at the center. Nicola pointed out that even though it's a pagan myth, Atlantis holding up the world is a powerful way of symbolizing how Christ truly upholds the world by saving it and by redeeming it by his precious blood. So Jesus Christ is the fulfillment, whether it was intentional or not, of all universal history. And that's true here as well, because whatever you believe about Atlantis, where it is, it's clear that that this story gives us a picture of what's happening in Deuteronomy 32, of what's happening in Psalm 82, of the fact that God has worked out history in this way, and this culminates in our Lord Jesus Christ gaining victory over those entities that were ruling over the earth. And that victory is what he proclaims in the gospel, and it's what we have been charged to bring into the whole earth so that we can liberate all people from their false gods, and so that we can liberate all people from their delusions. And, you referenced that there was the gentleman, I think it's a gentleman anyway, kind of in the comments trying to sort of troll. And I was just, interacting with him a little bit on the side, because I don't think anything he was saying was really on target, and I didn't want us to get sidetracked by him. So I just kind of was discussing with him. But even folks like that, the thing about it is that he may not be worshiping a false god per se, but he's worshiping the false gods of his passions. And Jesus Christ has set us free from that as well. So if you really love studying ancient history and or you just really are fascinated by this idea that the spiritual realm is much more involved in human events than we maybe see or discern or talk about a lot in the West, then all I would say is come and see. Check out these scholars that Nicola's talking about. Check out Dr. Mike Heiser. Come visit the Orthodox Church. Come and see the depth and richness of the reality we live in. There's no reason why you should have to live in a flat, secular, materialistic world when, or think that you live in that world, when the reality is you live in a rich, beautiful, enchanted world. And so come and see, come and check out this beautiful world that we live in. And I guess that's all that I would really have to say on that.
I would just like to say that there is one more resemblance between these accounts and what we also see in the Bible with some of the pagan nations, but also in the history of the world, including Aztecs, whom you mentioned. It's not a coincidence that civilizations like this get wiped out and destroyed, and it's not because of those evil colonizers. I think that, and this is again, I see this in history over and over again, that God allows every nation, every civilization, to a certain point to accumulate their sin and their evil doings. If they don't repent, he will use any tool available to him, and he has all the tools available to bring the destruction if the people don't repent. So I think the same thing happened with Atlanteans, with Aztecs, or what we see in the Old Testament, when God would send his own people and said, devote them to destruction because of those giant clans they had. But brother, I thank you so much for these 3 hours. I had no clue we would go even above 2 hours, let 3 hours long. If anyone watching this, not just tonight, anytime in the future, if you watch all 3 hours from beginning to the end, please message me. I'll be so impressed and encouraged. I'll give you a virtual medal because I don't have a real one. So please let me know.
Marathon man.
I was about to apologize, but then I'm like, but this was all important. Why would I apologize? So if I took time from you, Kevin, and then I apologize. But if I took it from the audience, I don't apologize. You can watch it in segments, and one day gonna cut it. Yeah, and one day I'm gonna cut it into little episodes, so people who are busy, they can just watch different videos that will be between 5 and 15 minutes each. But brother, thank you so much. It was such a pleasure to cover this vast topic. I believe we're only well, I won't say just scratching the surface. We went even deeper than that, but I don't think this is all there is to be said about Atlantis. But at least we covered 3 books. We spoke about a lot of context. We gave parallels with the Bible and different mythologies. We learned a lot, and in all these things, I enjoyed, especially because again, we are comparing everything to the Bible and pointing everyone to Christ, giving him the glory, because he's the one bigger than Atlas. He's the one bigger than Baal. He's the one who will come on the chariots, and he's the one who is going to rule over all of them. So thank you. God bless you. Enjoy the weekend. I want to thank all the audience watching now or in the future. Thank you for your patience and love. Please continue liking. It doesn't cost you anything. Continue subscribing, sharing the videos. Please also support Kevin's ministry. His link is in this video's description. Again, doesn't cost you anything to like, subscribe, share videos for either of our ministries, because it helps the algorithm to promote these videos to other people who may be in dire need. Maybe they have so many questions, and unfortunately not many churches and not many professors, scholars, or researchers are dealing with these topics that we're willing to, even if someone will point fingers at us. I'm talking mostly about religious perspective from our religious friends. Even if they're pointing fingers at us and laugh at us, saying, how can you even believe or read or talk about these things? Hey, we are here making ourselves as fools so that you can enjoy these topics as much as we enjoy them, honestly. So
yes,
thank you, Kevin. God bless you, and I'm looking forward to our future episode where we'll just talking about something else.
Me too. God bless.
Thank you. Bye-bye.